I gave him a shirt and he took it with him. I was like, obviously you don't like it that much. Yeah.
For those on the phone, if you can let me know if you can hear us all right, you can type into the chat window to let us know. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Kevin Quilliam. I'm with Incline. We're the program administrator for the Adjustable Block Program. To my right, going to the right, Anthony Starr with the Illinois Power Agency. Nate Hausman is with the Clean Energy States Alliance. They are a subcontractor who's working on this section of the program guidelines. And Samir Doshi also with the IPA. I'll go ahead and let Anthony say a couple words, and then we'll get into the meat of the meeting.
Great. Well, I would like to thank everyone for attending. It seems like perhaps because of the weather, we have more people attending online than in person today. But for those of you who came to the comfy confines of the basement of the Thompson Center, thank you for coming. And hopefully for those of you listening in to the webinar, you will be able to hear everything okay, and we'll be able to ask questions through the online chat feature. I just really wanted to thank everyone for participating in this process. Obviously, it's been a long time in coming. There's many, many details of the Adjustable Block Program that we're working on developing, and this is a significant piece forward in terms of beginning to put into effect some of the things that were contained in a long-term renewable resources procurement plan about how the program will be structured and what are the essential requirements to be an approved vendor and the consumer protections. For those of you interested in community solar, the consumer protection related to community solar will be coming second. We wanted to make sure to differentiate the two to make sure you gave proper interest to distributed generation, and then also, quite frankly, distributed generation projects are going to have to get lined up a little faster than necessarily finding subscribers to community solar projects. So this felt a little bit more timely to do it in this order. One thing you may not have seen yet if you go to the Adjustable Block Program website is we, a few days ago, put a calendar up on that website, which should give you an outline of some of the next steps of additional materials and additional comment periods that will be coming up. So it'll give you a flavor of what happens between now and our scheduled January 15th date when we plan to start taking program applications. So again, thank you everyone for participating either online or in person. We're really interested in hearing questions for you. Ultimately, the things that, comments today, we will take into consideration, but we do have some deadlines coming up for written comments on the things we're talking about today. Written comments ultimately are really what's most useful for us because we can review those in a bit more detail. So to the extent you have to make comments today, you can also try to submit those as written comments. That will be really helpful for us because we do want your feedback. Obviously, a lot of things are already hard-coded in the plan. Those aren't really subject to change, but the extent to which there's things that are open for discussion and that the input and wisdom of stakeholders can help us refine these proposals, we really will appreciate that. With that, I'll turn it back to Kevin. Thanks, Anthony.
Okay, we'll go ahead and start with the agenda. We've got a bunch of stuff to cover and broken into some discrete groups here. It's not advanced. Huh. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is just the welcome and introduction. We'll talk about the format of the stakeholder meeting and how it's going to operate. We'll cover the approved vendor requirements. These are the requirements that you'll need to meet in order to be qualified as an approved vendor. We'll move on to the Adjustable Block Program brochure. We'll talk about the disclosure form. This is the form that's required to be submitted to all of your customers before they have a project that's in the program. Marketing materials and marketing behavior. These are the guidelines for your marketing material, which we will have to review, and the behavior of your marketing teams. And then closing comments. The one thing I'll say about the agenda, we do have a couple hundred people on the phone as well as people here, so we do have a lot of interest. We are going to try and stick to this agenda as closely as we can with timing, trying to fit a break in as well. So if we still have questions and we're at the end of a period, we'll just go ahead and move on to the next section, but if we have extra time at the end, we can cover it then, and then as Anthony said, we'll be taking written comments as well. So meeting format, basically we're going to assume that you've read all of the material that was provided last week, and so we're really just looking for input in the meeting, so that's going to be the brunt of the meeting is getting input from you here. It is combined online and in person, and so we're going to try and keep that as integrated as we can between the two sides. For those of you who are online, we use the chat feature to ask questions. I see that a lot of you have already figured that out, but if you haven't, you click on the chat icon, which is probably at the bottom or the top of your screen, and then once you do that, you pop up the next screen, which is the chat screen, and then you can enter your questions there. Just keep in mind that the chat is viewable by everyone else on the program, and so don't type anything in there that you don't want all of us to see. And we will read aloud the chat questions so that everyone in the room can hear them, and vice versa. If you're someone in the room and you're asking a question, please come up to one of the microphones here so that hopefully the people online can hear, and I'll try and repeat your question as well so the people online can hear. So we're going to do our best to integrate the two meetings into one meeting if we can. Yep.
Is it possible to allow more people online to participate in the video that Skype up to you?
Okay, well that's good to know. Give me a second to see what we can do about that. Yeah, unfortunately, it's not immediately obvious to me how we would do that. So we may break early and, and do a quick call to the support just to see why that's.
Should we take a 5-minute break? I think.
Yeah, why don't we do that? We'll take a 5-minute break and we'll call support and see if we can figure that out. Thanks. Yeah, we can have it here. Unfortunately, everyone wouldn't know what the
But they can call in, so. They should be able to call in and get the audio, right?
Yeah.
The audio number is separate?
Yeah,
the audio people were able to hear, because we could also. Right. That might be a plan B.
Yeah.
Is it Lauren or who would be the first contact to your office?
They're all trying to get in.
Would you like to add more?
That was on our other service and I can't get it. Yeah.
Is this one actually limited?
Yeah.
For those of you who are on the phone, we believe we've fixed the number of connections, so we should be able to have additional people call in. So we're going to give everyone just a few minutes who were not able to join the meeting to join the meeting. And if you've been contacted by anyone who has tried to join, please have them try to rejoin again, and hopefully it will work this time.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started again. Apologize for that glitch, everyone. So once again, meeting format. If you're online, you'll be typing your questions in online on the chat feature. Everyone can see those questions, and we will read those off, and we'll alternate between questions here in the room and questions that are online. And if you do have a question in the room, please come down to one of these microphones up front so that everybody can hear. Okay, stakeholder process. We released the stakeholder documents on the 3rd, a week ago. We're having our meeting today. We're taking comments at the comments@illinoisibp.com or abp.com website. That is the program website if you're not familiar with it. And so please send all of your comments via email. They're due on the 19th for the approved vendor part of the comments section. And for the brochure, disclosure, and marketing standards, those comments are due on October 26th, both at 5 p.m. Central Time. We will be posting the comments, as we did with the lottery stakeholder process, on the website. So if there's anything in your comments that you don't want us to post, please provide a redacted version of your comments to us as well. Otherwise, they'll go up there. And just process-wise, we internally at the IPA and the program administrator will review your comments. And then there's a program guidebook, which is going to have a number of sections. And one of the sections is the approved vendor requirements, the DG, consumer protection section requirements. Those will all be in this section of the guidebook, and so that section of the guidebook will be published at the conclusion of the stakeholder process. A couple of notes. First of all, please restrict your comments and questions to this section. So if you have comments about community solar, we have another stakeholder process for that. Please hold off until that. If you have other questions, random questions about things, our phone number is there, our email is there. We're happy to talk to you about that offline. But we just, for time today, we want to restrict it to just the topics at hand. This does just cover distributed generation. That's what we're here to talk about today. We do have 2 future stakeholder processes scheduled. One is for community solar requirements and consumer protection, and the other is every other set of program guidelines that haven't been covered so far in a stakeholder process. Anything that we talk about today that you bring up, please follow that up with an email comments so that we have those in writing. And we are going to have a recording both of the webinar, and we'll have a set of the slide deck available to you at the illinoisabp.com website at the conclusion of the presentation today. I'm going to cut over now to the online portal. So the first thing I'm going to show you is what the approved vendor portal will look like. And the purpose of this is really just so you can see it and give you a little bit of idea what you're going to see when the program comes online. Very difficult to work backwards with a mouse.
Yeah, drag it down low. They try to drag it down to this thing. Okay. There we go.
All right, so basically, if you've worked in any other programs like the Pennsylvania APS program, this will look very familiar to you, but essentially, everything that we put in the approved vendor guidelines is going to be on this application. So when you would like to become an approved vendor, you will come to the portal and you will create an approved vendor application, and you'll provide all this information that is required, that list of information that we list here for us. And we've got it set up with a couple of different features. One is that you can have multiple approved vendors, and so if you're a large company that plans on having special purpose entities that you're going to set up, it's conducive to that. So you can have multiple approved vendors being managed under one login. And it'll be easy for you to do applications with that as well, or you can just have your single approved vendor for yourself. And the general idea is that you'll fill in your information. We try and shortcut the requirements for you as much as we can. So for example, you've already provided your login information, so if you were to hit use my contact information, it's going to pre-fill that information in for you, so you don't have to manually enter that. If there's anything that you missed, it's going to go back and tell you that you got to put it in. And there's several steps to the application. So once you successfully finish this section, oh, sorry, already done an application for our company, so. And then you can see the next section pops up. You can go revisit the previous section, and we've got a whole bunch of sections that cover the various topics. So vendor classification and project details, legal and regulatory information, document uploads. There's some stuff that you have to upload to us. That's all uploadable here. And then a attestation that you do at the end where you provide an e-signature that is accurate information. So you're going to provide all this information to us at InClimb as the program administrator. We're going to review the information you submit. We'll email back and forth to you if there's any questions we have on anything. And if you're approved, then you'll get an email, and on your dashboard here, it will show that you're approved. And then once you're approved, at this point, there's a couple of extra steps that you'll be allowed to do. Eventually, once you're an approved vendor, you'll be able to enter applications, but that's not going to start until January 15th. And so the idea here is to give you time to qualify as an approved vendor between November 1st and January 15th. And you won't actually be able to submit applications until January 15th. So just be aware that those features won't be available on the portal until the 15th of January. We do anticipate being able to turn the approved vendor applications around rather quickly, but if you want to make sure that you're going to get the January 15th eligibility, then please submit your applications relatively soon in the process. We're hoping to give you sufficient time to do that. Okay, so let's talk about the, oops, how did we end up losing the, approved vendor slide? Yeah, let's talk about the approved vendor requirements. So the purpose behind, the slide's not here, but we'll talk to it anyways. The purpose behind the approved vendor requirements is to get a set of guidelines so that the parties who are acting as approved vendors are both equipped to handle the 15-year contract term that's inherent in this program, and that we make sure that we don't have bad actors in the program, which can hurt the entire program for everyone who's involved, and so that we know how to contact the approved vendor. We kind of know what your corporate structure is. So people change, the first point of contact is going to change, they may leave the company. It's going to be important that we and the utilities be able to contact you throughout this 15-year program term. So it's very important to just keep in the back of your mind the list of approved vendor requirements that we published were put out there because of the fact that we're paying upfront, the utilities are paying upfront for a contract that requires delivery over a long period of time. And so there's a large counterparty risk that is being incurred here with the approved vendor as the counterparty, and so we're trying to minimize that with these approved vendor requirements. So that's our goal with the approved vendor requirements that we have. Hopefully all of you have read those and seen what they are, and we're curious what your thoughts are, and if you have any comments, questions, things you think we should add to the approved vendor requirements, things we should take away. One other thing that I'd like to emphasize here is keep in mind that we as the program administrator need to be able to verify the things that are asked, or at least have you attest to those so that we know that they're there. So the requirements need to be within the realm of being able to reasonably check those for a large number of approved vendors. So I'll go ahead and open it up to comments on the approved vendors if anyone has any questions or comments.
You want to start online?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and start online if nobody here has anything.
If you do have questions, you can come down to in the room, may come down to the mic if you want to in here.
So we had one comment, comment online that there was a suggestion for how to combine and sub-bullet the document, and that will be in the application. So thank you for that comment. We'll note that. Here in person, go ahead.
If you could identify yourself and your company.
Okay, so for the people online, the question is, if you have a project developer who's different from the ultimate owner, who do we need to set up as approved vendors? If we have special purpose entities, how do we handle special purpose entities, and kind of unpack that whole idea. So there's a few issues there that are kind of salient, and so as the plan is envisioned, or as the process is envisioned, you are able to do a single project approved vendor application. And so if you wanted, each special purpose entity could be a approved vendor, and the only project that they were allowed to have would be that one project that they owned. That alleviates the need for you to have your marketing materials reviewed, and a couple of other requirements that are only required for approved vendors that are going out to the general public, because you'd only just have your one. So that's a special subset of approved vendor called a single project approved vendor. So the plan envisions that. We have that programmed in. What I was trying to demonstrate earlier on the portal is the portal is actually set up to do that. So if you have 20 special purpose entities, you can just hit copy entity A, and it pre-fills everything the same except for the name of the entity, and you can type in the new name, and you can just rapidly create a number of single project approved vendors if you want to do that. Or you as the developer could be the approved vendor for all the projects you're developing, and then you could be the one that signs the contract. You're on the hook with that contract once you sign it, all the way up until the time that someone else assumes the contract. But the contracts, you can have someone agree to assume it, and so the ultimate owner could also assume the contract from you, so they could set themselves up as an approved vendor, and they could assume the approved vendor responsibilities that you previously had once you convey the project to them. So that's another option. And then a third option is an approved vendor doesn't necessarily need to be the owner of the project or affiliated with the project in any way. So there may be approved vendors that are out there that have many projects from many different developers and many different owners, and they just manage all of those projects. And so you could initially sign up with that type of approved vendor. You would contractually set up a contract with that kind of a company, and they could handle that, and then you wouldn't, we wouldn't require that shuffle in the middle. So options are there for you to do it however you want, and if there's another option that you'd like to see, then let us know. There's a question online: is can an approved vendor be a corporate entity versus an LLC for each individual project? There isn't any restriction on who owns a project. There are restrictions, as you saw in our published guidance, that you do have to be registered if you're a corporate entity to do business or an LLC or any kind of a non-person. You have to be registered to do business in Illinois, but beyond that, we don't say that you have to be a C-type corporation versus an LLC. As long as you have a valid corporate structure, then you can be an owner of a project, or you can be an approved vendor for many projects. So there isn't any kind of discrimination against different entity types. If you see that we're missing some kind of an entity type there, please let us know, because we think we got them all, but we might not have them all. And here in the room, please.
Could you identify yourself, please? Could you identify?
So the question for the people online is, will there be an opportunity for NDAs between the program administrator, IPA, and the project developers? And my question back to you is, what would the NDA cover, and what are the concerns there? Okay, so the financials, as we propose in the plan, one of the requirements is that an approved vendor provide their financials. Those financials would be considered proprietary information. We would not sign it in the NDA, I don't believe. Anthony can correct me if we're wrong, but it would not be subject to a Freedom of Information Act request, would be our intention.
Well, I'm going to let Samir, who's our attorney,
Okay.
go into a little more
Yeah.
detail, but under the Illinois Power Agency Act, there are provisions related to the agency and our handling of confidential information if no one requests that. And Incline, as our subcontractors implementing the program, really kind of falls under our umbrella. So I believe our confidentiality provision would cover that. Do you want to add that?
Sure. Thank you, Amy. I'm Senior Associate at the Legal Counsel of IPA. In the draft approved vendor application standards document, under evaluation criteria, paragraph 8 states that the company's balance sheet and P&L will be protected proprietary information that will be used by IPA and program administrative staff and will not be disclosed or subject to FOIA disclosure. So there's two parts of that. One is our intent and policy under the Adjustable Block Program. Second is our legal position that the sensitivity and confidentiality of financials would qualify for exemption under the Illinois FOIA law.
I would just, one thing to note is that when the IPA was first set up, we were set up primarily to handle power purchases for utilities. And those obviously contain quite a lot of sensitive confidential information. These last few years, we were procuring around $900 million of power a year. And so, we have robust, we've never had issues around confidentiality. Obviously, a past doesn't necessarily predict the future, but we are used to handling sensitive and confidential data.
And just to summarize that for people online, the general consensus from IPA staff was that there are significant measures in place to ensure confidentiality of material like the balance sheets, financial statements of applicants for the approved vendor program. Okay, online, the next question is, for clarification, if you're operating multiple LLCs, are they all entered under one approved vendor login? And again, it's really up to you if you want to do that. If you would like to set up a number of single project approved vendors, which is perhaps something you would want to do to avoid the requirements for marketing material review and other requirements as a general approved vendor, you can certainly do that, and the system will be set up to allow you to do that rather easily. So you could have multiple LLCs, each of which was its own approved vendor. They would all be managed under one login. And so for you, it would be just entirely your choice whether you wanted to do that or whether you wanted to set up a single approved vendor and that approved vendor manage the projects of many LLCs. So either of those is a legitimate, and it will be just as easy for you to administer one way or the other. So it's entirely up to you internally in your corporation or organization to determine how you'd like to do that. The next question is DG versus community solar. If we're interested in community solar, is this meeting still relevant? Mostly, community solar will be covered in the next stakeholder meeting. Apologize if perhaps you were one of the ones who was cut off with the original limits we had, but we do have another stakeholder meeting set up for community solar, specific to community solar. Feel free to remain with us for this, but primarily we'll be talking about DG.
Can I add one thing there?
Certainly.
The process of registering to become an approved vendor is really not different between community solar and DG. So I think the first half of this, or third of this meeting, is very relevant if you're interested in community solar. So when it comes to specific things having to do with disclosures, marketing materials, that is what will be different between this meeting and the upcoming meeting on community solar. But in many ways, a lot of the community solar things will build on this meeting. So I think there is potentially some relevance to this information as well.
And just to summarize for those online, if you would like to be an approved vendor for community solar, then the process is the same. So you would need to listen in on that if you're concerned about that. There are just additional requirements for an approved community solar approved vendor. And for those who would like to do both, we just give you the option in the application. You can check as many boxes off as you want. So you can be a regular approved vendor, or a regular approved vendor and a community solar, or one or the other. So it's up to you. Go ahead. You're asking, so the question is essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that the special purpose entity is not going to have a meaningful profit and loss statement because it's, you just set it up, and do we need the financials for the parent company? That's a good question that I'm not sure we have talked through. So maybe, what are your thoughts on that? Okay. Yeah, that I'll throw that out there. That's a good. If you have thoughts on whether we should or shouldn't do that, please provide that to us in the written comments. Sure. Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I would tend to say that although if you're not guaranteeing it, then there's a question there too. So I think there's a couple of different things to think about on that particular question. So it's a great question, and thanks for posing it. So I would correct, so the question was basically how easy is it to assign the contractor for someone to move from one aggregator to, from one approved vendor to another approved vendor if you have an aggregator type model. And I would caution that the contracts, keep in mind here that the contract that the approved vendor has is with one of the utilities, one of the 3 utilities. And so although we're the program administrator, we do not administer those contracts. Those contracts are between you and the utility. Whether it will be easy or not for you to assign the contract, it will be entirely up to the utilities contract teams, because they'll be the ones who are administering that. Certainly we would strive as the program administrator to make those processes as easy as possible, but really at the point that you hold a contract with the utility, we're not party to that contract any longer. So it's an important thing to keep in mind as you think about this, because you may be thinking about this like somehow we're in charge of the whole process for the whole 15 years. And in reality, once you sign that contract with the utility, although there is annual reporting that we do and we are part of that process, your contract as the approved vendor is with the utility.
But I would note that in our approved plan, there's specific provisions that if you assign a contract to someone else, they have to agree to all the applicable terms and conditions of the approved vendor. Are you imagining a model where there's someone who, for whatever reason, is unhappy with you as your approved vendor and wants to move the whole contract to another? Well, maybe you prefer vice versa. Remember, these are rep contracts. Right. That are front loaded. Right.
Yeah, and I would say, so just for the people online, the question is, because the person financing the project might want to know that the REC contract is ultimately with the utility and not with perhaps a less creditworthy approved vendor. They want the assurance that if they want to make themselves an approved vendor and take over the contract at any time, are they allowed to do that? And that's very clear in the plan that is the right for them to do that. And we could certainly articulate that clearly in the guidebook as well, but they would definitely always have the right, if they were willing to assume the approved vendor mantle for that project and we approve them as an approved vendor, that yes, indeed, you can't hold their project hostage. They can take the project to a new approved vendor.
Let's take a second look at that.
Okay.
A few questions about that.
Okay. Yeah, put that in comments, please, and we'll talk about that. We'll grab you as soon as we get another online person. another question about if you're operating multiple LLCs, are they all entered under one approved vendor login? The portal is, the architecture of the portal allows you to do that. So if you wanted to have a whole bunch of single project approved vendors, you could do that, and you just have to log in once, and you would be able to do whatever you wanted with multiple single project approved vendors under one login. So it should be relatively easy. You should be relatively ambivalent between having one approved vendor or multiple approved vendors under one login, for what that's worth. Yep.
Basically, you already have a approved vendor and a contract. Like, I think what you're doing, it's already contracted, and then you want to become your own approved vendor after that.
So there's two contracts that we're talking about. I just want to clarify there, and then I'll maybe have Samir provide some more background on that. If the project owner has a contract with the approved vendor to be their approved vendor, we have nothing to do with that. That's a bilateral contract that the approved vendor and the project owner have between themselves. So if they sign a contract and say that, you know, that I guarantee you'll be my approved vendor for the entire 15 years, that's your internal contract, which is different. And I think that the question was the other way around. So you're kind of asking the opposite end of that same question. You're saying, can the person then get out of the contract by asking to change it later? Is that kind of the thrust of what the concern is?
So I think, like, we have X company signed up, we're serving as the approved vendor. Year 2 of the contract, they are not approved vendor, X company is not approved vendor. Year 2 of the contract, you know, they're no longer comfortable with the approved vendor credit, or something wants to split. They then become an approved vendor and take over their own contract. I know that's somewhat we're assigning the contract to them, but they're not approved vendors to take over that contract.
So they would, if you're going to take over the contract, you have to be an approved vendor. So in all cases, you have to be approved by us as an approved vendor to have a contract assigned to you. And I guess maybe Samir can talk to what happens if you have, I guess the situation that I kind of see, the question coming up is what if we're interfering with the contract between the approved vendor and the developer, the owner of the project, and they have a contract that says they're going to be, you know, locked in for this amount of time, but now they want to change, you know, are we supposed to be enforcing that contract? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Clarifying question. Are you imagining a scenario where this is with your assent or without your assent? I think the first is simpler. Second is more complicated.
I think in the plan, we stated that the contract between the system host and the approved vendor must be assigned to a different approved vendor. I think an open issue, and is alluded to, whether that requires the consent of the existing approved vendor. That's certainly something we can take for comment. That's one part of it. The second part of it is for the contract between the utility and the existing approved vendor for a 15-year term of direct delivery. To what extent will that be assignable? And will that be assignable with or without the consent of the utility? We haven't developed or announced a draft contract for the utilities and the approved vendors yet. We're in very early stages of developing that internally. Frankly, I think that's something else we can take feedback on. It's not necessarily formally in this stakeholder forum that we're doing today, but probably at a later time. And certainly develop your comments this process. Think about how that would interact with the utility approved vendor contract. The contract between the utility and the approved vendor. I would say we'll probably publish it before the end of the calendar year.
Yeah, I mean,
Just for those online, the question is when will the contract that the approved vendors sign with the utilities be available?
we're still specking things out. We haven't quite put a timeline on it. So,
I guess
obviously, it will be available obviously before the program launches, and it would, like we've done in our competitive procurement, there will be an opportunity to make comments on it. So we're working through a bunch of details of how to take the language in the plan and turn it into contract form.
Okay, yeah, I guess one thing I'd flag, especially with smaller systems, I guess there's still a lot of work that needs to be done between when that contract is available and actually getting them into the contracting process. So the earlier that's available, the better. I think that if that is available, not until the first of the year or something, yeah, it's going to be challenging.
Sure, again, remember, what we're talking about is contract between the approved vendor and the utility, not the contract between the approved vendor and the host.
And just to summarize for those online, so the additional comment was it would be helpful to have that contract available as soon as possible from the approved vendor's perspective, and that's noted by IPA and the administrator's staff. And then there's some, if you missed it online, the other discussion was about when that would be available. Obviously, you know, we're working on it now. We certainly have already started working on it to some extent. And then the other question was around whether you needed consent from the losing approved vendor, departing approved vendor in various circumstances. And so those were two things that we would solicit comments on from you, and that we don't have a clear-cut answer for those right now. So just to summarize for those who might not have heard. Okay, the next question from online is, does the O&M provider need to be an approved vendor? An O&M provider could be the approved vendor, but you don't necessarily have to, they don't necessarily have to be the one. So it's your choice of who the approved vendor is. The project owner could be an approved vendor for their own project. You could have a solar developer or an installer who acts as the approved vendor for all the projects that they develop or install. You could have a third-party approved vendor who provides approved vendor services to all comers. You could have a third-party approved vendor who only provides services to a certain segment of the market or to a certain subset of installers or developers. So it's entirely up to you who you want to have your approved vendor. The only requirements are the approved vendor requirements, which we're talking about today. As long as someone meets those requirements, they can be an approved vendor.
I think a key thing to also note is, though, that the approved vendor is ultimately responsible for the behavior of the entities below them in that food chain. So if you are not in a situation where you're using an aggregator type model, the aggregator is responsible for the conduct of the installers who they're aggregating.
Ultimately, the contract is between the approved vendor and the utility, not the utility and the ultimate solar owner, the homeowner that owns the solar system, for example, solar array. Next question from online is, does the approved vendor need to be registered in PJM GATS? Right now, in the requirements, and this flows from the plan, they do need to show us that they're registered in either PJM GATS or MREPS, which are the two tracking systems that can be used in Illinois. The next question is, we had some requirements about reporting any kind of criminal convictions that of staff of the company. And so the question is, could we potentially change that to a job-related misdemeanor, especially for misdemeanors? And the concern is, if you have a solar-branded crew truck who gets a speeding ticket just on a weekend or commuting to and from the job site, is that something that would have to be disclosed? Do we want to have to disclose that? So I think that's probably a good point, that we want to make sure that we filter out misdemeanors like speeding tickets that we don't really need to know about.
That seems reasonable, and clarifying language on that would be helpful if you have examples from other states.
Yeah, okay, so for people online, the IPA comment was, if you have any suggestions from other states or other jurisdictions of good language that would address that, then please provide that in the comments. The next question is from online is, what happens if the special purpose entities do not have a full year of financials? For example, they were just set up. I think that goes to the question as to whether we'll require the financials from the parent entity of the special purpose entity. That may be the solution to that. So again, I would say provide your comments there. That's closely related to the earlier questions. The next question is, will the IPA be publishing a written Q&A based on this meeting? The intent is that we would publish this live stream of this meeting, and so you can listen to it as if you were a webinar participant, and any written comments that are sent to us via email will be published. The next question is, how do you expect Bullet F to be operationalized in practice? Is there some threshold for reporting Are these meant to be Illinois specific if a company is a national entity, and what's done with this info once provided? And Samir, maybe you can refresh me on what full point F is. Since I
Sure. Question 24 of the proposed approved vendor application starts out, within the past 5 years, has the business any affiliates or any current former owner, partner, director, officer, principal, et cetera. And then there's a list of questions. Question F is, have they been suspended, canceled, terminated, or found non-responsible in any contract, or had a surety called upon to complete an awarded contract?
For the people online, the section F is basically, have you essentially failed to perform on a contract, and you're required to list that as an answer. I would step back one step and tell you that the answer to all of these questions is used by us as the administrator to determine if you're a suitable counterparty for these 15-year contracts and can be an approved vendor. And so to the extent that you're a massive international company and you have a $10,000 contract in Lower Slovenia that you failed to perform on, we would take that for what it was, in the context in which it would be provided. On the other hand, if you're a small installer and you've done 3 $10,000 installations, and 2 of those $10,000 installations were contracts that you're not performing on, and for a public entity, for example, then that would be weighed very heavily against qualification as an approved vendor. So this entire application is really taken in context of all the information that you provide. So there isn't any one thing on the application that if you say yes to that, then nope, you're right out. We're not going to even consider you for being an approved vendor. It's the totality of your application, and that's, in a way, it's almost better for you that we're collecting a large amount of information, because that way, if you just have one minor issue that doesn't really affect your ability to act as an approved vendor, we can easily see that in the totality of the information that you provide. The next question is just as prior to the close of the comment period, so I think we missed the first half of that question, if you can type it again. The next question is, what's the relationship or interplay between being an approved adjustable block program vendor and the DG installer certification with the Department of Commerce? The interplay is that you have to have the DG installer certification to do DG installations, but it's not a requirement if you're an approved vendor to have that if you're not doing installations. So if it's not required solely because you're an approved vendor in this program. So for example, if you're an approved vendor who just acts as an approved vendor for projects that were developed by someone else, and that someone else who is actually building them has the appropriate certification, that approved vendor does not require them. So the intent of the question that we ask is to say, if you're required to have this, do you have it? And our thought process behind that is that people who have not operated in Illinois might not realize that this is a requirement in Illinois, and so it's kind of jogging your memory to say, hey, maybe I should look this up, because it's not common in every state to have this type of requirement. So we wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of that, and that's why we're asking that question.
But to be clear on that, this does not absolve the actual end installer who's doing the installation from having that certification. That is required from the Commerce Commission, not the Department of Commerce. We're just making the distinction between more of the aggregator model and the sort of approved vendor who is also an installer. Yeah, just to clarify for the online folks, it's the ICC, not the Department of Commerce, and it's the ultimate installer is ultimately responsible for it.
And, one more thing, the statute that authorized the Adjustable Block Program and other new renewable programs, also Act 99-96, requires that all of the new solar installations, including Adjustable Block Program projects, be installed by individual human installers who are qualified persons, as defined in the definition section of Part 468 of the Illinois Administrative Code, Title 8.3. That definition relates to certain training and apprenticeship and certification. So the actual installers must be qualified.
And for the people online, Samir was just clarifying that the actual installer needs to also meet the definition of a qualified person. So the actual human who's doing the installation needs to meet the qualified person requirement if they're participating in the adjustable block program, and that is a distinct requirement from the company's certification. The next question from online is, we're interested in both DG and community solar. Should we register separately for DG and community solar, or can we act as an approved vendor for both? And the answer is you can act as an approved vendor for both. So it's up to you to select. You can select DG, and later on you can add community solar to your approved vendor status, or you can select just one or the other, or you can select both now. It's entirely up to you. The only difference is that if you select community solar, you'll have access to different parts of the portal to provide the additional information that's required for community solar projects. The next question is, how do you handle a situation where your parent company will provide the financials and credit, but the special purpose entity without the financials is a business registered in Illinois? Same question for the PJM gas aggregator account, or the account to the parent company and not the special purpose entity. So that's probably the first part of the question I'll defer to IPA on. Does the parent company of the special purpose entity have to be registered to do business in Illinois, or can just the special purpose entity be registered to do business in Illinois?
I think we may need to look into that one.
Okay, so the answer to that is we may need to look into it. And the second one, I would say we'll probably need to think about too, because I'm not sure the possible unintended consequences of allowing just the parent to have a GATS account. That may be fine. It may not be. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, you can put them in the written comments, and we'll think about that as well. Go ahead, for on-person question. Yeah, so you won't be kicked out. So you can have multiple people logged in at the same time. You can't have multiple users who have access to the same account. It becomes a much more complex problem that way. But you could have multiple people who are working on, so if you wanted to have multiple people who are doing applications at once, for example, you can certainly do that. All right, we're going to close, because we had a little bit of a delay here, we'll probably go about 5 minutes into the next segment here on this. Someone said it was hard to hear, so I'll try and speak up a little bit for the people online. Apologize for that. Is it permissible for a special purpose entity to be set up using financials by a larger backing business entity? Again, I think that's an open question that we solicit your comments on, and we'll try and clarify. Next question is, does a tax equity investor who purchases a transaction have to be an approved vendor? The tax equity investor wouldn't necessarily have to be an approved vendor, but that project would always have to have an approved vendor. So again, the approved vendor model is flexible to be used as you wish, as long as at all times the project has an approved vendor. So you could have a third-party approved vendor, you could have the original developer remain the approved vendor, you could have the new tax equity investor become the approved vendor. It's entirely up to you, with the caveats that the approved vendor must be approved by us and registered as an approved vendor and approved as an approved vendor, and that the project always has to have one. The next question is, what happens if a special purpose entity does not have a full year of financials? So again, I think we've kind of tried to address that as best we can. The next question is, 3 current or prior customers who can act as references, are there any way that we can get privacy protection for those 3, like the financials? Yeah, everyone's kind of shaking their head for those online, that seems like a reasonable request. Please put that in written comments to us to the email. That's a good question. The next question is, are the marketing materials provided under item G of the attestation also going to be treated as proprietary and confidential? I would say, so that's basically the marketing materials that we review are those proprietary. I don't know if, I mean, kind of by definition, because they're marketing materials, they're going out, but it is company-specific information, so I'm not sure. Not sure that there's an obvious answer that we have off the top of our head, but certainly something that we should talk about.
I think if parties would like the marketing material to be treated as confidential, then maybe in written comment explain what aspects of it should be confidential and why.
Okay, so for those online, Samir asked for those who believe that they should be confidential or aspects of them should be confidential or proprietary to just articulate what aspects would be proprietary and under what reasoning. Keeping in mind that a good guide for you to think about that, although not the only guide, is the exemptions from the Freedom of Information Act. In-person question?
Follow-up question, marketing materials. You mentioned that we just need materials by
The full gamut of marketing materials that are related to the adjustable block program. So I don't care what you do in Massachusetts, but anything that's related to stuff that you're selling under that will be in this program in Illinois, we need to review. And just to clarify that, when we say marketing materials, we're not necessarily just talking about your written marketing materials. We're talking about everything that your web advertising, everything that you're doing that's reaching customers as marketing.
Yeah, and that's essential. I mean, if you have wonderful written material, so you set up a billboard with horribly inaccurate information, that does no good. So that's why we focus.
Okay, the next question is, you've indicated that we can submit one vendor for approval with multiple LLC special purpose entities under a single login. Does that still allow the PPA and lease agreement to be between the off-taker and a special purpose entity, assuming the LLC special purpose entity is part of the single login application? So the PPA need not be with the main approved vendor. The answer to that question is that the PPA, the relationship between the host and the PPA provider. We'll talk a little bit about this in the disclosure. It's relevant in the disclosure that you have to provide, but as far as we're concerned in the program, we're not collecting that contract as of now, although if you have comments on whether we should do that, we can certainly talk about that. But the contract between the host and the PPA provider is really not of concern to us. The concern to us is that project has someone who is the approved vendor, who's been approved as an approved vendor by us, and is taking on the full responsibility for the rec delivery over the 15-year contract. So whether that's the PPA holder who's taking on that responsibility as the approved vendor, a third-party approved vendor who's taking it on, it's many different business models you can use. We are not picking any one of those. It's up to you to decide which one you want to use. The next question is, the administrator and IPA will use the financial statements as part of a risk-based assessment of the potential approved vendor's ability to act as counterparty. Is it not the owner of the SREC who is the party and the other party is the buyer of the SREC? The installer being called a counterparty does not seem to be legally correct. And then also a question on the audio from the IPA staff. So the way we're configured here is I'm trying to repeat to you what the IPA staff says because the audio is difficult for you guys to hear. So again, the bottom line is that the contract is between the utility and the approved vendor, whoever that approved vendor is. And so if you're Joe homeowner who has a system on your home and you're creating those credits and you use an approved vendor to act as approved vendor, that approved vendor is responsible for ensuring that your system produces its SRECs, and those SRECs are entered into the tracking registry and delivered to the utility per the contract. The ultimate responsibility and all of the responsibility rests with the approved vendor. And it's up to you between the system owner and the approved vendor to set up whatever kind of arrangement that you set up to ensure that that happens. But at the end of the day, if recs don't get delivered, it's the approved vendor is on the hook for that. One more question and then we'll move on to the next subject. If multiple projects are awarded under a single vendor, can the projects be subsequently sold separately, and must the purchaser of the project also be an approved vendor before the sale is allowed? Again, who owns the project is not of terribly great concern to us. It's who the approved vendor is for that project. So if you have an approved vendor who manages projects for hundreds of different owners, and one of those owners sells to a different owner or a person who isn't an owner, that approved vendor remains the approved vendor. So until the approved vendor and someone else assumes that contract as the approved vendor, the person who originally signed up as the approved vendor is the approved vendor. And so at the adjustable block program, that's the contract that we're concerned about. And what you do to sell the contracts for the underlying project, who owns the project as the host or as the owner, is not relevant to the contract. The contract, again, is between the approved vendor and the utility. So we're going to move on now to the brochure. There are some more questions online, and we can come back to those if we have time at the end. Okay, so switch of focus a little bit here. The brochure is intended to provide basic consumer information to consumers in a way that they can easily understand. It's originally the thought process was that we're talking about homeowners, but really it involved any consumer. So it could be a very large project. It could be a 2-megawatt DG project at a university, and the consumer there is the university's public works department. They also need to have a simple, easy to understand explanation of the project. And so this brochure is required for all DG projects. It's really right. I saw a little look like that wasn't right. It needs to be provided at first sale contact with the customer and at contract signing. And so if you have salespeople who are going out with this brochure, the intent is that every time they make contact with a customer, they have to hand them the brochure, and when they sign the contract, they also have to hand them the brochure if that's not done at the same sitting. The approved vendors would print this brochure. It wouldn't be specific to you as an approved vendor. There's just one brochure. You would print off as many copies as you would need, and you would hand it to them. It's an IPA-branded consumer brochure. You're not authorized to change it or do anything to it. You just print it out and you give it to the customer to make sure every customer is level playing ground. They've all gotten the same brochure. That's the intent. Discussion items for this particular one, what would be involved in requiring that the customer let us know that they received the brochure? Is that something that we need to require? Do we want an attestation on the part of the approved vendor to attest to the fact that the owner received the brochure? How do we make sure that this brochure is actually getting delivered to people? Do we do spot checks? So any thoughts that anyone has on that and how onerous or not they would be to the operation versus, again, going back to our intent of what we're trying to accomplish here, we would welcome those comments. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions or comments on the brochure. Uh-oh. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there.
My comment applies to the disclosure form, where we fully support including contact information to the AG or whatever regulatory agency necessary. But in our experience, if we include some sort of reference or recommendation that the customers first try to work it out with their vendor, with their installer, that can lead to better outcomes and also avoid regulators being potentially overwhelmed. So, in other words, we have a good rapport with our customers, but if on the disclosure form we get, if there's any problems, contact the regulator, they might not see their installer as their first option if they should. And obviously, if you can't work it out with the installer, they should go to the regulator, they should go to the AG. But you can hear why about it and recommending they try to work with the actual.
Duly noted.
So for those on online, the comment was the aggregators the approved vendors would prefer that we try and work everything out on the lowest level, and that the first step not be that you instantly jump to the regulator when it could easily be rectified with just a call to the original installer or the approved vendor. Obviously, that's in our best interest to achieve that as well, so we don't deal with things that could easily be solved. So that's, again, a good comment to put in writing. Yeah, go ahead.
One of my concerns
Yeah, absolutely. So the question for those online is, as an approved vendor, you want to make sure that what you provide the customer meets muster, and that you don't inadvertently give the customer something that's not, that we would later on say that's not an accurate representation of the brochure. So the brochure, we plan on having a PDF version of the brochure that if you hit print and hand that to the customer, that's the only way you can meet the requirement for the brochure. It has to be in exactly that format, so there'll be no discretion involved, which means that there'll be no risk involved as long as you handed them that brochure. For the disclosure agreements, we'll get to those in a minute, but I think we have a solution for that as well. The disclosure agreements will actually be generated on the portal, and you'll print that out and hand that to them. So there'll be a standard disclosure format that you will not have discretion over either.
So what we released last week was draft text. We haven't formatted it into like a nice brochure. The point right now is to take input and comments on these documents. So we have the brochure, the 26th is the due date for comments. So we will revise the text of the brochure based upon feedback we get at the comments, then produce a final version, and that will be the document that you provide to customers. Similar concept with the disclosure form. So so you don't modify the brochure. It's not a brochure from your company. It's a brochure of the program that, per our approved plan, is something you have to provide to them. Two other points to make there. One is, obviously, we want to get feedback now to try to get it as good as possible. No one's perfect. We may find over time the brochure needs updating. So we may in the future update the brochure, obviously give everyone advanced knowledge that there's a new version of the brochure coming, and it can accommodate that. The third thing I wanted to note is that we will be doing quality, lots of better word, quality control checks. We may reach out to actual homeowners, et cetera, to do evaluation and verification, and we may ask questions like, did you receive the brochure? Can we see a copy of it? So we find someone is taking our PDF and through their own artistry modifying it. That's not good. We have a provision in the plan having to do with grandfathering systems in, because yes, the law allows systems that are energized after June 1st, 2017 to participate. So in the plan, there are provisions that would allow people who have already developed systems to catch up. So obviously, if you've already signed a contract, someone built their system, you can't have provided them the brochure yet because it's not final. But when the requirement status disclosure form, you can retroactively go back and provide that to people. How we would deal with that if there's changes in the brochures going forward, I think that'd be yet to be developed. We may have to start setting, like, as of such and such a date in a few weeks, you have to change which brochure you're using. We'll try to be pragmatic about that.
The plan provides that if the contract is already executed, the contract between the vendor and the brochure is already executed before the IPA finalizes the brochure and marketing guidelines and disclosure requirements and so forth, then the vendor will have an opportunity to provide the final brochure to the system host or owner, provide the disclosure form, and amend the existing contract as needed to conform with whatever the IPA's final requirements are, and thereby would be eligible for the adjustable block program. There may be some elements of a system installation that already happened that might not be able to be remedied if they weren't done in a compliant manner. The most obvious thing I can think of is if a qualified person did not install it, then it'll be too late at that point to make the system eligible for an adjustable block program contract. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So just to clarify, we need to have time to make things right.
and for those online, the questions were around what do we do about systems that were previously installed, and do we have time to give them a brochure, even though we obviously can't go back in time to provide it at the point in which it's required? And the answer is that yes, you will have adequate opportunity to do that. And one other question of yours that we didn't answer was, when will these two things be available? Our intent is to have them available as soon as we can. We fully understand the idea that you would like to be handing this brochure out as of, tomorrow if we had it, so that you know that you're compliant as of then. So we're very well aware of that. Obviously, we have to put it out for comments, get your comments back, and incorporate those before we can have the brochure ready. So we're definitely cognizant of the timing issue. Let me go one online, and then I'll come back to you here. So the next person is the first sales contact is in the contractor's place of business. Are salespeople required to provide a brochure? And how about online for international companies? So the answer is the first point of contact with the customer needs to be provided, regardless of where you happen to be or where the customer happens to be. I think that's pretty cut and dry in the plan.
And online is obviously a PDF.
Yeah, and online you can provide a PDF, as Anthony is to that point. Go ahead.
Comment and follow that on, allowing us to have usually DocuSign, where especially for systems that are already installed, we're talking about 45 days, 50 days, depending on when it's published, final form. So then you can contact the client where it's signing, and then sign off on the contract on top of it. It could be used to give us the work that we have, so we could do it in and allow online signatures, especially given that we're only listed with so allowing us to visit and including that in our discussion,
Okay. Yeah, of course. So for online, the comment was, to the extent possible, can we make online signatures available, e-signatures, various options in order to manage the workflow. So again, very cognizant of that. We'll talk again a little bit more in the disclosures, but our plan is for the disclosures to be able to be e-signed by the customer to show that they received those. So they'll get an email and they'll be able to click on that and go. There may be a period of time where that functionality is not yet available, but it's certainly a before launch of functionality that will be available. So we're very cognizant of that. IPA in general is very supportive, and correct me if I'm wrong on that, of minimizing printed and signed wet signatures when they're not absolutely required. So that's very good input, and we've been thinking about that since day one. Thanks. The next question is, can the brochure be emailed to the customer ahead of first sales contact or contract signing? As long as the customer actually gets it, then how they get it is we're not going to insist that it be handed to them in person. It's just that they make sure that they get it. Go ahead.
Question about, do we need to be advising customers to use brochures? You mentioned the ball that,
Yeah.
What if they throw away, what if they don't remember they got it?
Yeah, so for the online folks, the question is, does the customer have to keep the brochure so that if we later check, and they have to produce it? So this is a pretty pragmatic program, and so we're not going to penalize you if the customer didn't save the brochure, but we'll certainly ask the customer if they had it. It's probably in your best interest to tell them something like, can you please keep this, because they might forget that they had it or not. And if you put it, I had a solar installer put a solar installation on my house, and they handed me when they finished it, they handed me a folder, a binder, which I think most solar installers do, that had all the information about my house, and if that brochure was required, they would have stuck that in there, and I have that in my closet. And so if somebody ever came and asked me, I'd be like, oh, I'll pull out the folder, and yeah, here it is. Yeah, I did get that. I remember it now, but it's up to you. Then it behooves you to do that, but it's not required that you do it. We're just making sure that that's the case.
But if you do have comments related to, if you think that, for example, that should be a provision in the disclosure that when there's an attestation related to that, I would, welcome input on that.
The next online comment here is related to the section that talks about terms of the loan. There's a section where we talk about kind of questions you should ask. And the things that may be missing from that are, what is the effective simple payback term in years? What is the levelized cost of electricity compared to other methods of ownership? And purchasing the system has the lowest cost of electricity over its life and is usually the most cost-effective of all options, should that sentence be included in the brochure as well. So again, please enter those as comments. I'm not sure on the last sentence that we could universally say that that's always going to be 100% the case, so we might not be able to put that in there. But certainly send those in as comments. Next online question, if company A meets with customer X 3 times, do they have to provide the brochure 3 times? And the answer is no. The intent is only that they would provide the brochure the first time they met with the customer and at the point that the customer signed the contract. Someone pointed out that DocuSign signature seems to be the most logical solution. Certainly an e-signature is what we're aiming for in most of these. It may not actually be DocuSign, the company, but it would be something of similar ease and familiarity with anyone who's used e-signatures. Next question, there should be a definition of consumer that limits it to residential and possibly small commercial customers. There should not be a need to provide these materials to larger, sophisticated commercial, industrial, and institutional entities. We certainly welcome your comments on that. I can tell you that our internal discussions about that were that might be what you would guess from first blush, but we've had a lot of contact with entities that are very sophisticated entities in their field, but not sophisticated entities when it comes to solar. So they may be the best home furnishing that you can put together yourself with manuals that are written in pictograms. They may be very, very good at that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're sophisticated when it comes to solar installations. And so it's not, we found in our contacts that we've had so far in the program that we're getting a lot of very basic questions and very feeling over their head and not understanding what they're being told from their installer type questions from large commercial, industrial, nonprofit customers who would have these large systems. And so that's our thought process behind it. But again, we welcome your comments as to why that may not be the case.
And if anyone can figure out a way to explain what a renewable energy credit is in 2 or 3 sentences in a way that makes sense and that people can remember, we certainly would welcome that comment, because I think we're not alone in not having figured that out. I think the number of inquiries I've gotten where the distinctions between tax credits, renewable energy credits, probably a few other things are lost even on, as Kevin said, fairly sophisticated customers, is an ongoing and real problem. In Illinois, we're focused more on renewable energy credits than programs in other states. I think that is a real challenge. It's the certain ease of it, but again, I think it's a way of thinking about renewable energy and how you incent it. It's very different than people are used to from elsewhere.
And just for online, Anthony's comments can be summarized as if you have a good way for us to convey what an SREC is in 5 words or less, or 3 sentences or less, please let us know.
100 sentences.
Go ahead.
But in terms of all these forms that we submit with the contract, there's often several contracts that happen throughout your, especially residentially. You have your system installation contract, your direct contract, you have a metering agreement, you have a connection agreement. There's kind of a number of contracts that go with every system, and I would think generally there's a time lag between the system installation contract and the direct contract. I know especially different for the existing system, which one of those contracts are you guys contemplating here? And I guess just in general be aware of, because I think there's a lot of different layers of contracts going on that are not happening at the same time.
So for those online, the question is, which contract are we talking about? Because often with an installation, there's a number of different contracts: the installation contract, the rec contract, the net metering contract. Which contract are we talking about? I think that's exactly the kind of question that we have these meetings for. So I'm not sure that there's an obvious answer to that, but we would welcome your comments on which, what the correct point is. Again, with our idea is that we want the customer, before they make a significant commitment, to understand what they're significantly committing to. And so, off the top of my head, I would say, well, it's the first contract at which they make a significant commitment, but which one is that? You would probably know that better than we would. So.
And I guess kind of some of the issues I've been seeing as an aggregator, I see this happen where, installers may go out, talk to that customer, they're going to sign and they're going to pay before they ever, and a lot of times before they ever talk to us, that's going to be their first vendor. So basically, they've already made that financial commitment,
Yeah, we've talked to the online, the question is what happens if through no fault of their own, the customer signs the contract and then later they try to go to an approved vendor and the approved vendor, can't meet the requirements because the system's already been installed or the contract's already been signed and that hasn't been done. So we've talked internally about ensuring that we don't penalize the system owner simply because, whoever was ahead of them didn't give them a contract, and we can't preclude them from ever participating in the program again. I think there's a couple of different types of situations where that would occur. So one would be that you are a approved vendor as an installer and you're not providing that, in which case we would take action against your approved vendor status because you were the guy who should have been the entity who should have been doing that. It was obvious that you would and you weren't. If you're an approved vendor like your entity, for example, and you have several different installers that are feeding you projects, I would say that if that happens a couple of times, and you explain to us what happened, that obviously we're not going to penalize them, but if it becomes something where we know that installer, Chuck on a Truck installer sends you a whole bunch of projects, we're always getting projects from you from Chuck on a Truck, and every single project from Chuck on a Truck doesn't have the correct requirements, at that point it becomes inherent on you as the approved vendor because you're ultimately responsible to ensure that Chuck on a Truck vendor meets or installer meets those requirements, and it's ultimately your responsibility.
Okay, I want to add just a little bit of flavor to that. So in terms of, I hope you hear we want to be pragmatic where we can. Samir already alluded to, for example, the qualified persons requirement in the law. So if there's an installer out there who installs a system and does not use a qualified person, and then comes to an aggregator and says, we want you to submit this to the program, that's unfixable. So, I want to be, pragmatism will have its limits. The other side of that, though, is I think this maybe will come clear as we get into the disclosure form. So obviously the brochure as a PDF, anyone can make a copy of it. So you could have an installer out there handing out brochures left and right, even though they don't have an approved vendor they're working with. But when you see, as we get into how the disclosure form works, that's something that actually gets populated through the program website. So a installer out there who is not affiliated with any approved vendor really won't be able to produce the required disclosure form. That might be something that might help mitigate some of this issue of installers not figuring out their relationship with the approved vendor before signing contracts to install systems.
And I guess I'm contemplating scenarios where we've got system owners come directly to us. Hey, somebody installed an installer we're going to work with before installed it on my house. How do I get direct or how do I get my rent? And that's the point where we can't really stop that from happening if we have no relationship there. But you're going to end up penalizing the homeowner for them not meeting all the requirements. There's no fault of their own. And again,
Yes, I would say submit some comments on how you think we can solve for that based on, I completely understand what you're saying. We've internally discussed this already, and so we're aware of the issue, but we don't have a silver bullet answer to it either. And so, it bears more discussion internally, and we would welcome whatever comments you have on that. So.
And one more thing related to in the approved long-term renewables plan at section 6.13, page 1.4, it states that the IPA would publish a list of contract requirements, which we actually did not do as part of our October 3rd publication of the various market documents. I think we thought that many of the topics covered in the disclosure form could be adapted for contract requirements. But I think we welcome written comments on how those two might interact, and if there's any other issues and points not already discussed in the disclosure form that could be part of contract requirements.
And just to summarize for those on the phone, Samir's point was that there is a requirement in the plan or a section in the plan that talks about contract requirements and IPA developing contract requirements. There's interaction with that, the brochure and the disclosure agreement, and any comments you have on how those interact and whether we need separate contract requirements or those can be rolled into disclosure requirements. And we'll talk about this again more in the disclosure section as well.
One last point, I don't think this is directly responsive to your question, but in the disclosure form, there is a provision that says is system installation contingent upon selection for adjustable block program incentives. So there is a provision related to that.
Yeah, and again, I'm working in a scenario where.
Yeah, I know, I know.
So Nate made a comment that there is a provision for making the contract contingent on getting the rec contract, which we understand that installers may sell projects that are contingent on that project getting a rec contract because otherwise it wouldn't pencil out. The next question from online is, if the developer already has a customer in mind and the customer is willing to undertake the project, is the brochure still required? And the answer is yes, the brochure would always be required, even if a customer, comes in over the transom and says, you must install this for me, and you've never talked to them before, it's self-referral, you still need to provide them the brochure under the way that we envision the program working. Another comment just supporting seamless e-signatures. It's noted, and we hear you on that. The next question is, do approved vendors need all clients to fill out the Schedule A form if they wish to manage all of their generated SRECs? So I'll first mention that you're able to manage the RECs from this program in MRETs or PJM GATS. I believe that Schedule A is just a PJM GATS form, and the Schedule A is really just a form internal to PJM GATS to let you know whether you're allowed to manage the account or whether the owner of the system is managing the account. Again, you have to show us to become an approved vendor that you have a PJM GATS account, and at the project level, when you complete your project, you have to show that you set up an irrevocable transfer to the utility who holds the contract for that project. Whose GATS account the system lives in is really irrelevant to us. So you could set up that irrevocable transfer agreement from the generator's GATS account, and that they stays as a one system GATS account. You could have an aggregate GATS account with, 50,000 systems in it, and you set up irrevocable transfers from each one of those systems on a system by system basis to the appropriate utility. It's immaterial to us. Will there be a Word version available if we want to provide a redline version of the brochure with our comments?
You have an email request for that?
Suppose, yeah, you can send us an email and we'll send you a Word version of it if you'd like to do that. No secrets there. What if we have a signed PPA or off-taker letter of intent, but the brochure is not signed off? Will this mean the DG project is not eligible to participate in the REC, or can the brochure be signed once the REC results are published? So I think this is a little bit of interaction with the lottery, perhaps, is the question. The intent is that you would provide this brochure. So if you're selling a project in November and the brochure is available, you provide the brochure to the customer, even if you don't know whether the customer that project is going to be part of the program or not. If you think that there's a chance they'll be part of the program, you need to provide them the brochure. Otherwise, the one thing you'll know for sure is that they couldn't be part of the program if you don't follow the requirements.
Providing one PDF should not be that onerous for the size of these transactions.
Yeah, and Anthony's comment for those online is that it's just providing one PDF or one printout, so it's not a super onerous requirement. The next question is, if the installer is required to perform a shading study of the site, you should ask to see this study. Not sure about required. Helioscope, PV Sketch, PV Sys, or other solar company EPC tools have reliable accuracy compared to an on-site human solar pathfinder-like analysis done. There's interaction between what the plan requires for an application and what's required in this brochure. And so a shading study is required by the application, and I believe that that's actually hard written in the plan, that we don't actually have discretion on that particular thing. And so if indeed a shading study is required for the project, then that was why we put it in the brochure, that you would provide that shading study to the customer. Is it mandatory to provide the brochure for systems that are already installed? I think we covered there's certainly an exemption for systems that are grandfathered under the program because if their systems back to June of 2017 are eligible, and for systems going forward which didn't get the installation, we welcome your comments on that. Seems to be a multiple term confusion between brochure versus disclosure form. So the brochure is independent of the disclosure form. It's a completely independent document. The brochure is simply a static document that is the same for every customer who is a participant in the adjustable block program will get the exact same brochure. The disclosure form is specific to each project, and it involves specific terms for that project based on the location, size, SREC output, and whatnot of that project. And we'll talk about that momentarily. Go ahead.
But one common question that I usually get from customers that's not addressing here is insurance requirements, both for residential and commercial. Required, insurance on there. And other point is just a question, is it written in the security document that an installer be a qualified person? It is part of the act, correct? So how do we hold?
We're not
We're not trying.
You can't.
Yeah, right. Well, there is an exception, I believe, for Illinois Solar for All. I believe the language is slightly different, but I'll check that. But for the adjustable block program, yeah, if someone, again, that's I think the point we're making. If someone installs a system without a qualified person, that's not fixable.
Right.
If they use the wrong sort of meter, that can be replaced. Yeah, no, there will not be exceptions. I mean, I've done many calls over the last year for people who want to do it-yourself installations, and they tend to be pretty unhappy with me when I explain this provision to them.
It just sounded like I thought it was to say we're looking for comments on how to.
So the comments would be more on if you failed to provide the brochure or you failed to provide the disclosure agreement at the time of contract signing, how we would rectify that. And the point is that you cannot rectify some things like the qualified person. That's just unrectifiable. So sorry, that's just how it is. If you can hold on 1 second, though, I'll repeat your question, and then I have a question back to you. So the comment was that oftentimes customers have questions about insurance. And can you elaborate for us on what type of questions they're wondering, like whether they need liability insurance for it, or whether they need to change their homeowner's insurance, or what specific insurance are we talking about? Just so we understand what kind of questions that we're getting.
They all require insurance provisions in the insurance agreement. So, I mean, it's something that has to be addressed, and why not address it front? Because it's essentially increasing the homeowner insurance, it's a policy that covers the cost of replacement of solar. So the commercial insurance, it's the same, whatever property insurance they have, it covers the value of the solar.
Okay, so that's an Ameren requirement. I guess we can look into that. So they won't interconnect unless you have insurance?
Right.
But they don't specify, if I remember correctly, they don't specify what level of insurance.
They don't, they make a request to be listed insured and then provide a copy of the policy declaration page that has them as a listed insured. It's a request, not a mandatory requirement. So, some insurance companies are not interested in having utility insured on the policy, right? Others could set up. At this state farm has willing listed Ameren as an additional insured on the policy. But I don't think all insurance, like I know, not all insurance. So you have to provide a declaration page, so it's a good check. You have an insurance
Okay, and for on the phone, the explanation was that at least Ameren requires for the interconnection that you have a declarations page for insurance on the home. It's not required that you name the utility as an additional insured, but it's an optional item. Thank you. Again, that's I learned something new from that, so thanks for thanks for sharing that. When will the written Q&A following the stakeholder meeting be published? Could IPA please publish it prior to close of business Friday, ideally before then, so stakeholders can review it at least a week prior to when the first set of comments are due. So the intent is we will publish a a copy of this webinar that you can listen to and a copy of the slides. At this point, we do not have an intention to publish the written Q&A of the meeting, but you could certainly listen to the appropriate section of the meeting if you had a question as to what the answer or the question was for that section. Our customer is able to reach out to any approved vendor to make sure they get SRECs. This assumes the install happens prior to the SREC program. How would they go about getting those now that the program exists? So as Samir alluded to, there is a section in the plan that addresses grandfathered projects. To be honest, you can't guarantee that your customer will get SRECs until they have an SREC contract, simply because it's possible that a block would be oversubscribed and that there will be a lottery and that their project will be far down on the waiting list of the lottery, which is subject of another stakeholder process with the lottery. So I'd recommend going to the IllinoisAVP.com website and reviewing that lottery procedure if you anticipate that. So please do not guarantee your customers a REC contract prior to actually having a approved Part 1 application in the program. Yep, go ahead.
So I was reviewing the brochure and disclosure document really from an uninformed point of view. And so I have questions about the role of the approved vendor and some of the details on some of the language here. So I guess my first question is, are you open to suggesting to create more context, kind of consumer-friendly context? So this is the program that we are offering. The program is something that's correct, which is what I'm trying to understand. The incentive that the program creates is that the rest that will be selling will be pre-sold for 15 years, and that should provide you with a financial benefit. Is that correct?
So the question for those online is if from the perspective of a consumer, this is completely new to, how would we word what exactly it is that the program is, and is it correct to say that they're pre-selling their SRECs and that should offset the cost of the system? I think.
What is that benefit to the consumer? They don't even know what a rec is, let alone an SREC.
Yeah, and that goes back to that's a great point, and it goes back to Anthony's comment of we've struggled, and those of us who've been in the industry for a decade or more have struggled for a decade or more explaining what an SREC is and what is it to the consumer. So certainly to the extent that we can make that language clearer, we're more than open to it.
So the question for the program is that free sale of the SREC expected to reduce cost to the consumer, or is it possible that the vendor would just keep that?
So, yeah, that's a great question.
Transparent to the customer.
Yep.
What that is at all.
Yeah, exactly. So for online, the question is, how do we know that the customer is actually going to see any of the money from the SRECs, and would that be transparent to them? So hopefully when we get to the disclosure form, that will answer that. So we attempted to make the disclosure form very clear to say this is how much money is the system's getting from the SREC program. If you're only seeing $5 and we have the number $5,000 here, it should be very clear to the customer that, yeah, indeed, there's $5,000 at stake and I'm only seeing $5, what's going on. But we feel that that's crucial. We agree with you, that's crucial. So to the extent that that's not, glaringly obvious when you read that disclosure form, then we would want comments on how we could do a better job of making that obvious. And maybe we can put something to that effect in the brochure as well.
Yeah, I think one thing we wanted to do is appreciate that there may be multiple business models out there. So you may have one company that chooses to use the revenue from the RECs to reduce the installation costs. You may have another vendor who keeps the installation costs the same, but once the payment for the RECs comes, send a check to the customer, either for the full value of the RECs or maybe have a processing fee. We don't want to foreclose those options, but I think as Kevin said, one of the intents of the disclosure form, and maybe it's sounding like it didn't come across clearly enough, is that the approved vendor does need to disclose to the customer what is the revenue being received from the program.
And just to that point, especially when you're talking about lease and power purchase agreement models, it's hard to have to get at that information. But the idea is, you know, we're aiming for transparency, of course.
Yeah, and I would note quickly for the Illinois Solar for All program, there are more stringent requirements about what portion of the savings go back to customers. But that does not apply to the more general adjustable block program. So the question is about whether there should be a reference to smart inverters in the brochure. I think we wrestled with that one. At the moment, the smart inverter rebate is not available for residential customers. Obviously, the brochure goes beyond customers. I thought we had, in one of them, I thought there was a small reference to the smart inverter. Maybe it got lost.
I think we might have taken it out because of the fact that it's something we discussed back and forth whether we should put that in there.
Okay.
And I don't, yeah.
There's a footnote in
Okay.
the draft brochure on page 2. It says, commercial and multifamily residential buildings may also be eligible for the purchase generation rebate.
Which is, I mean, one of the problems is that you don't see in the law the reference. There's no smart inverter. I think the words may be used somewhere in the law, but in fact, the section that creates the smart inverter rebate is not called smart inverter rebate. So, you know, we want to be accurate on that. But again, that is something that at the moment applies only to non-residential customers.
And so that's not a piece of equipment that consumers should be aware of when we're available?
Well, first of all, remember, it's an optional rebate. You don't have to take it.
Oh, I'm not talking about the rebate, though. I'm not talking about the rebate. I'm talking about the actual.
To be prepared in case when it changes. So my understanding of it is that once we switch to smart inverters, it will be because net metering has met the net metering caps. So you would be grandfathered into net metering if you were old, and you wouldn't need to be prepared for this thing in the future. I think that was your question. But it's worth considering. You know, we'll double check that to make sure that's an accurate representation. I think the other thought we had when we were talking about this is we didn't want to confuse a homeowner to be like, what's the smart inverter thing? And they do a bunch of research on it only to find out that it's not something that's currently for them. So we wanted to manage, because it's such an overwhelming amount of information, we wanted to manage the amount of information as well.
And presumably, when the smart inverter rebate is rolled out to all customers, we'll have to revise the brochure accordingly.
And I think just throughout, I mean, to your overall point, is that is the balance that we're trying to strike with creating language that's going to be customer friendly and understandable, but as well as get to some of the nuances, which is in fact quite a complex transaction or can be.
So certainly, if anyone wants to provide written comments about what additional content, if any, the brochure should mention about the so-called smart inverter rebate under section 16.6 Agricultural Utilities Act, please send that along.
For those online, Senator's comment was if you have comments on the smart inverter idea, please let us know. Go to a couple quick ones from online. Is there an offset % rule for customers? I'm not familiar with what that question would be referring to. An offset % rule? So if you can clarify that question, sorry.
I have an educated guess, but
Not familiar with that. The next question is, where do you get a PJM gas account? As the expense is not sounding like a smart aleck, it's from PJM gas, and so if you do a Google search for PJM-GATS, it will take you to PJM gas, and they have an account opening system there. And the other organization that you can also use instead of PJM gas, if you wish, is the MRETS system. MRETS is MRETS. So those are the two registry tracking systems that can be used.
one note I want to make about GATS is, if you're not familiar with it, it's hard to find on the website, but they actually have very good training aids once you find them.
And GATS also has a staffed customer service line that I can guarantee you will be happy to walk you through every step of that process, as does MRETS. So feel free to give them a call if you have any questions on it. Next question. We'll do disclosure forms. So
You got a clarification on that question?
yeah, I'll get that to the bottom here. So three more questions, and then we'll do a quick break and then move on. So the next question is a comment. If the signature is required to ensure the customer received the brochure, that we have that signature period at the time of the subscription agreement signing, not at the first contact. So essentially they're saying don't require the customer to sign something the first time you contact them, because that just kind of puts them off the whole idea that they're signing something. So that's well noted. Thank you for that. That's a good point. Someone else.
The disclosure forms currently don't have a place to a text related to that at all.
Yeah. Someone else just confirmed that Ameren does require proof of insurance for interconnections, and most co-ops do also, so thanks for that note. The next question is, as the approved vendor, what is the anticipated process if the system owner turns off the system? For example, they move houses and the new homeowners haven't occupied yet, and that delay may be as long as a year. Is the approved vendor responsible for paying or providing that lost production, for example? So again, to reemphasize it, ultimately the approved vendor is ultimately responsible for delivering the SRECs under the contract. So whatever else happens, whatever drama happens between the approved vendor and the system owner is between the approved vendor and the system owner. But at the end of the day, subject to the caveats that are in the plan with like the 3-year rolling average and the fact that you are taking a portfolio look, subject to those requirements, yes, as the approved vendor, you're responsible for providing those SRECs. I would also note that there's a force majeure section, and so this specific example would not fall under that force majeure exception, but for example, the house burning down would fall under the force majeure exception, in which case the approved vendor would provide us the details of that and the plan for rectifying the situation. We would make a determination if it met the force majeure requirements, and then we would move on. So again, we're rather pragmatic when it comes to those kind of issues, but if it's just an issue that someone doesn't want to do something, that's not excusable. Okay, we didn't get a, the offset rule is that can a customer only overproduce a certain amount compared to what they consume to qualify for net metering in the adjustable block program. So we don't run the net metering program at the adjustable block or the IPA. And so I won't speak to the net metering rules. I'm roughly familiar with them, and so I'll let you get interpretation of that from the appropriate net metering regulations and tariffs. The adjustable block program, I guess the question is, could someone build a 2-megawatt system on their home for the adjustable block program? I'm not sure that it's actually specifically precluded in the.
Well, if it's on their home, that means they have a big enough roof, they might have 2 megawatts of load. The definition of distributed generation in the Illinois law, it mentions the idea of primarily offsetting load. My understanding from the utilities is, given the fact that there's very little distributed generation in Illinois, they've been a little loose on what exactly that means. But my understanding is that they're working towards tightening up those requirements to limit the amount of oversizing. I think anecdotally I heard a thought of potentially 110% of load. Of course, the question is, how do you define load? Is it the last month? You have to do, especially for new construction, you might not have historical data. So there's parts of it that I think are still a little fuzzy, but I understand that this is something the utilities are looking at to ensure that there is not distributed generation systems that are designed to more than offset load. And on the net metering side, there's a maximum amount of time net metering credits can roll over. So at the end of the day, on the net metering side, oversizing the system is going to have limited benefits. It may smooth things out on a month-to-month basis, but
yeah, I mean, I guess the only example I would consider, if you think the SRECs are so valuable that you want to build a system that just makes SRECs and you're not going to get any payment for the electricity, could you do that? For a net meter distributed generation system, you have to have a net metering agreement to hook it up to the utility system, and so at that point you're subject to the net metering tariff of the utility that you're interconnecting with, and we simply go off of that. At the point that you're a DG system that's selling into, let's say, market settlement DG system.
I don't think we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, so I think that the issue is really solved at the tariff level by the utility. Okay, we're going to take a short break for everyone now, just 5 minutes to use the restrooms, and we'll play it by ear for people to get back. The restrooms are a little bit tricky. You go out the door directly behind us and take a right, and it looks like they've drywalled the wall over where the bathroom is, but that actually is a door. So go ahead and push on that door, and it'll get you in, and those are the bathrooms. So don't go out to the food court. Just take an immediate right when you go out, and we'll reconvene in 5 minutes. If we can get everyone to take their seats, please, we'll go ahead and get started on the next section.
Yeah, right.
You all right?
Yeah. Corrupted my head.
So the system will work much better once people apply before they install the system. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find somehow. Not familiar with your computer.
Now we're going to close this one. We did much of it. Let's close this one.
Thank you, 116. Okay, for everyone on the phone and here, we're going to move on to the disclosure form. So in broad brush terms, the disclosure form is intended to allow consumers to make an apples-to-apples comparison between the offer they may be getting from installer A, approved vendor B, third party C, so that they can look at one document where everything is written in the same manner, comparing the same things, so they can accurately evaluate different offers against one another. We have separate disclosure forms for owned, leased, and PPA systems because internally we determined that those systems are different enough that they require some different language. Much of the disclosure form is common between the different formats of ownership. However, there are specific questions that are specific to each of those ownership types. The idea would be that these forms would be completed on the portal. So once you get your approved vendor approval, you're approved as an approved vendor, you are given a portal on the site where you enter the required information that allows us to create this disclosure form. The portal will create the disclosure form for you, and you will print that disclosure form off the portal and provide that to the customer. The functionality that we intend to have there is that you could also provide the email address of the customer, and our portal would send the disclosure form to the customer and allow them to acknowledge receipt of that form. And then you wouldn't have to be involved in anything beyond giving us the information to allow us to do that, and we would handle it after that. And we would, that would hopefully alleviate some of the responsibility of you tracking that they actually received it and informing us, and then it allows us to be sure that they received it because we're the ones handling that. So that's our intention, but again, we'll take comments on whether that's a good idea or not. And the information that you provide for the disclosure form that will also need to be provided when you do the application will still be there. So if you do a disclosure form and you say, I'm planning on putting a 10 kilowatt system on this person's house, here's the parameters of that system, and push button, it goes to the consumer and they say, yes, we want to do it. Then on January 16th, when you come into the portal and you're ready to do your applications, that will already be started as an application, and all the information you've already provided to us will already be filled in, and you'll just have to provide the additional information that's required to make it a full application. So hopefully it will minimize the duplication of effort, knowing that you're going to be doing disclosure forms that don't turn into actual projects, but at least the ones that do turn into projects, you won't have to double enter that information. The information, the discussion items for this that we have questions about, a couple of items and one that's not on here. First is how to account for changes between the initial contract and the final completed project. And so one issue that we have is that we run programs like this in multiple states. We run the Pennsylvania Portfolio Standard Program, we run the Delaware program, we run programs in Massachusetts, and so we've done literally tens of thousands of applications for people who are applying to programs like this. So we're well aware that your 10 kilowatt system might turn into a 9.5 kilowatt system when you actually get on the roof and find out that there's a couple of vents you didn't know were there, and there's a soft spot on the roof, and for whatever reason, you can't make the system exactly like you did. So we need to think about what are the parameters for what happens when you gave a disclosure for X and you provide Y. If it's a difference of 2 panels, do we really need to worry about that? Yeah, maybe not. If it's a difference of you said you were going to produce a 3 kilowatt system and you build a 12 kilowatt system, then yeah, that's a pretty substantial difference. Where do we draw the line? Those are the kind of questions we have on that. Specific contract guidelines that are not in disclosure, so we alluded to this earlier, that there's language in the plan about standard contracts and contract terms that are required. Can we meet the requirements of that with the disclosure form, or do we need a separate contract guidelines for approved vendors? What are your thoughts on that? And then Nate had one other additional question he had on the formula that we were going to use. And so at the end of the guideline, we kind of left open that we're going to do a calculation based on a escalation rate of electricity prices. I'm sure that many of you would like to use an escalation rate of like, say, 10% a year to show that you're going to have a very, fast payback for the system. We might say 0% a year is what we've seen in the last X number of years. There may be some other number. So provide us your input with backing as to why we should use a particular escalation rate in that formula, and anything else that you think that should be in that formula, especially something that may be unique to your company that we may not know of from standard industry practice, knowing that, we've seen thousands and thousands of leases and we're familiar with the escalation clauses. It's just an area of concern for us because obviously by manipulating that number, you can change the answer. And the other thought we've had in doing that is that we have perhaps a high, a medium, and a low escalation rate, and we provide all 3 of those numbers for someone. And if you think that's a good idea, let us know what you think those 3 rates should be or whether you think that's a good idea. So another area. It's not, okay. All right, so if anyone here has any comments on disclosure forms, I'll start with that while I try to fix the.
Can you identify yourself again?
So the question for those online is, how do we envision this working with an approved vendor model where the installer wouldn't have access to this online system to generate the disclosure, and how would we, how would we work through that? I think the idea is that you have to figure it out, basically, to be blunt. You'll need to have the installer convey to you the information that's required and bring it along. I mean, I think we're open to suggestions on how to do that. It's a real problem, and I can understand where you're coming from on that. Maybe there's a way that we have shared logons for your sub installers that allow them to enter data in a limited way. Again, though, you are responsible as the approved vendor ultimately for that. So to the extent that you want to have quality control on it, it's there. I'll point out for all of these requirements, we intend to have a couple of different automated abilities for you to upload those. So one is via an API, application program interface. So if you have the sophistication to build an automated interface, you could do that, and also through an upload interface. So one solution might be that you use our API to expose, on your website, just like you do for people entering meter readings for GATS. They enter the data and it goes through your login to that. One might be that we do a CSV upload as an Excel spreadsheet, essentially, where you provide, they upload, they give you an Excel spreadsheet with all the info, and then you can just upload it and push a button, and it generates all the disclosures. So a number of ways we can potentially solve that. Give me your ideas on that. Yeah, that's a fair idea. We'll think through the implications of how that would work. There's just nothing that we couldn't expose to anyone to use. The only trick is making sure that we can convey the data back. So maybe we do something where they can select an approved vendor off of a drop-down list, and then if they select you, it gets sent over to your queue, similar to what you see in aggregators in Pennsylvania, for example. So we have the technology to do that. We do that in other places. So there's no reason we couldn't do that here. So.
That it has to be provided as a contract signature, how will that be written out, or that it is this contract, line up, how does that work?
So the question for the folks online is how do we know that you actually provided the disclosure at contract signing? The idea right now is that the customer is just verifying that they got it at contract signing. So because the customer actually has to sign it off and say, I got this, we would ask them, did you get it at contract signing? And they would say yes or no. And maybe we put some explanation there. If they didn't get it at contract signing, they could say no, but I told them that, for whatever reason, they put it there. But right now, because the customer is actually the one confirming that they got this, that would be our verification. And we consider the customer to be a credible source because they're the ones that we want to have it. So the API for different pieces. So the application API will be available when the application portal launches, more than likely. An API for this specific functionality would probably be ready before January, but it's not going to be ready on November 1st, just because of the amount of time that we have to incorporate comments and know what's going to be on the on the form. So we were aiming for a mid to late November release of the e-signature capability here, and it depends on what the comments we get, for example, about having everyone have access to it and how that would work. So there's some variables there.
As you're sitting now, going through your installation contract, which is going to happen for your direct contract, and all these separate contracts, things are going to change. I mean, things can easily change as you're going through that contract. You have to go regenerate and disclosure forms.
So the question for those online is when things change, which will happen multiple times, when do you have to what triggers a new disclosure form. So again, that's one of our targeted requests for comments on that particular thing as to where we draw the threshold as to what needs to change. So in general, our thoughts are that we would rather not have to have you redo it for every one panel change in the size or 2-degree shift in the azimuth. But that we want to make sure that if there's a significant change, that actually changes what the customer is seeing, that they know that, and so it's just a matter of where we draw those lines. Yeah, so for those online, the comment was just being aware of how many different parties are involved and how many different steps are involved. So it would be really helpful for you and your comments and anyone else in their comments if they'd like to maybe iterate the parties and steps in a typical contract, or maybe 2 or 3 different versions of a typical contract, so that we had those kind of in front of us. Okay, we'll go to the online questions. So first of all, sorry about we weren't showing the right slide. Hopefully that's fixed now for everyone online. There's a question about whether there will be a separate disclosure form for rooftop versus community solar subscriptions. The answer to that is yes. We do plan on having a separate stakeholder process for community solar, and it would be a separate disclosure form for community solar subscribers, which would be its own distinct form from this. Yep, go ahead. Are you talking about the collateral or which? Okay. So the question for the online people online is does the disclosure form disclose the clawback, what the clawback amount is, and how that works? So our intention there is that the only person subjected to the clawback is the approved vendor, not the homeowner. And so if you want to pass on that clawback risk to the homeowner, you would do that contractually in a bilateral contract between you as an approved vendor and the homeowner. And do we want to list that separately? That's a good question. I mean, so that's something we should think about, because it would make a difference if you were subjected to that or not. The next question from online is, if the disclosures to be generated through the portal, you will need utility rates and net metering policies in order to create the savings estimate. How will you do this for all the different utilities and rate plans? Co-ops and munis have different net metering, energy metering policies than the investor-owned utilities. So that's a challenging question that we talked a little bit about. If you have any comments on how to do that, we can. Our intention initially was that you as the approved vendor filling out the form would be responsible for entering the rates for that particular customer. And we would depend on you to accurately enter the rates for that customer in order to generate the form. The net energy metering policies for co-ops and munis being different between them, if you could articulate the specific munis and co-ops that you think have net energy metering policies that are different enough that it's going to screw up the form, that would be very helpful for us if you could do that, because there's a lot of them out there and a lot of different formats that they do. So we've worked with a number of them with other programs, but we certainly cannot say we've worked with every single one of their net metering policies.
And on the utility side, one thought we've had also is using the utility default service price as a starting point. Obviously, as a retail choice state, people could be on any number of different areas, any number of different rates. But again, disclosure form is covering multiple things. One aspect of it is to allow apples-to-apples comparisons between potential offers from 2 different installers, for example. So in that sense, using the utility rate so it's the same helps create that apples-to-apples. Obviously, it's imperfect because actual rates people are on may vary if they're on an ARIES or municipal aggregation, or for that matter, real-time pricing. But at least it seems like it's a reasonable level setting. Wait, communities and co-ops is definitely a more complicated issue.
All right, in-person questions, go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, hold on, I'll summarize and then you can go, just so I don't forget what you said. So, for those online, the, one point was that just reiterating that we have an ability for non-approved vendors to do the form, so that's, we've spoken about that already. The other idea was that we have a button that someone could use so they could just pre-fill things that they've already filled before if they have a standard PPA term in their company, so they don't have to keep refilling that. Or do some kind of standard template, so that's a great idea. We definitely are all about that, so we'll make sure that happens. It may not be in the first iteration, but it'll definitely be on our list. And then the first comment, because like I said, short attention span. Oh, using the same rate. So the first point was that we have a standard rate for a ComEd residential person, so that the different installers can't game, or approved vendors can't game it by using higher rates in the disclosure. And then you had one other thing.
Well, and then I was going to talk about on the lease point specifically about how the agency incentives are not allocating them the value to the customer. I guess that we've been about to be able to say you're able to get a lower lease rate and would be without the incentives. But I guess how exactly are we supposed to fill that and say that they are giving 95% of the customer collateral of that value to that lower lease rate, or does it actually have to be a check with the customer?
So two questions packed in there, or two good points I think packed in there. One is that the 5% collateral, do we need to disclose when we say how much the approved vendor is getting? They're really not getting that, they're getting that minus 5%. So maybe we haven't thought about that. That's probably something worth thinking about. Because there's a requirement that they hold back 5% of collateral until the end of the 15 years. So if we say the approved vendor is getting $5,000, the customer may say, where's my $5,000? And they're not really getting $5,000, they're getting 5,000 minus 5%. So, well, that's a good point. We'll think about that. Do you have any comments, Nate, on the lease, how we convey to the customer what they're getting out of it, since they're not really getting, there's really no cash up front, maybe?
Yes, the idea for the provision that's included in the PPA and the lease, you know, if it's a rebate, it would have to be a 1-for-1 after the fact, and the idea was so it couldn't be gained. We struggled with how to provide, you know, how to get at that transparency to provide, especially in the lease and PPA contract, to communicate how that flows, because obviously there's so many variables that go into those monthly rates. So I would just say that we invite your comments on that point, and if you've seen other examples related to that.
Yeah, it's we don't want to say, oh, you're getting 0% value, we're not going to check, because we wouldn't go off the product at all. You are getting value.
And as you know, the concern would be that people would be just talking that incentive without it going to the customers, and there wouldn't be transparency about related to that. So that's cool.
We just want to make sure there's a way forward. We were afraid that it would be something where you guys would be expecting us to say 0% going to the customer. But really, we have kind of, if that was the case, that's a little.
So to summarize for those on the phone, the comment is that if you're doing a lease system, the lease lessors don't want to have to say that they're giving 0% to the customer when effectively they may be able to buy down the lease rate for that, and that questions it. And our comment is provide input to us on how we would accurately convey to the customer that there was value being transferred here, and at the same time let them know
not necessarily that it's all being pocketed by the lessor, since they may be incorporating it into their lease price.
Yeah, and the way it's structured, you know, it says the expected value of the record debit payments that will be received by the approved vendor for the PV system is blank. So, you know, so that just clarifies what the approved vendor would receive related to that. And then the sub-bullets relate to if there's a rebate. We wouldn't expect that if there's not a direct rebate, we wouldn't expect you to fill out that if so you will receive blank money or blank percentage of the value of the direct payment for that. No, you you simply say, no, there's not a direct rebate being provided, and then you would not, that section would not be perfect. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I think some of these clarifications, we you know, in the formatting process might be made more clear too, so it's a good competition.
Just to summarize, Nate was pointing out that that section, if you entered that there wasn't a direct rebate, would just not show up on the application. They're dynamic applications, so those just wouldn't show up there if that was the case. We have a comment online about what the escalation rates are that vary between 1.769% to 2.29%. So with actual direct numbers from a utility back to a certain year. So that's exactly the kind of information that we'd like to get from you. So thanks for that. Please provide that in written comments. Question about, have ComEd and Ameren provided feedback on the counterparties to the REC agreement? Do they have a preference for vendors that are also project owners, because project owners would have the incentive to make sure the systems are operating correctly for the life of the contract? We have not specifically addressed that because the plan is agnostic to whether the approved vendor is a project owner or not. And so it's not really something that's, I think it's not really up for discussion at this
Not
point.
their choice.
Yeah. What if initially a customer goes for a 5 kilowatt system and later, after 5 years, they want to expand their system to 10 kilowatts? How can we account for the changes? So the plan actually does account for that, and we plan to account for that. And in every other program we run, we have expansions. It's very common to have expansions. This is not something new to solar or to us or to the program. There are some, it's not really relevant to this particular thing. You would have to do a new disclosure, obviously, for the expansion portion, and there's some recalculations that may have to be done because the size of the system, if you were originally under 10 kilowatts and now you're over 10 kilowatts, for example, you have to look at the system as a whole, but that would be covered in the last stakeholder process, how we account for that. The next question is, or comment is, regarding the savings estimate, can a single project take advantage of both the inverter rebate and the adjustable block program renewable energy credits? If so, is the inverter rebate applied for separately from the adjustable block program? So the inverter rebate is not part of the adjustable block program in any way, and it's the tariffs, which, from what I understand, they're not actually even yet approved for both utilities for the inverter.
As I'm sure many of you know, through current ICC proceedings, approved the tariffs that have been proposed by Ameren and ComEd under Section 1617.6 of the Public Utilities Act. Those will probably be finalized by the end of the calendar year, I think. And then those will be available for non-residential customers and community solar projects, but not this time for residential.
And the customer applies directly to the utility.
Yeah. So just to reiterate, for those online, it will only apply to commercial and community solar. At this point, the tariffs are not yet finalized. If you have comments for the tariffs, then we would encourage you to go to the ICC process to make comments on those tariffs, but we really can't tell you the answer because the answer has not yet been determined on any of those tariffs as envisioned now would be through the utilities. But in any event, we at the adjustable block program are not involved in the smart meter tariffs, and we would not be collecting any information on that. Next question is, what if the host customer for a net meter behind the meter system goes bankrupt in, say, year 7? They would no longer consume any energy, but we would obviously want to continue generating energy as a QF qualified facility, delivering to the grid and being compensated at the day-ahead price, and continue delivering RECs. Does the host customer have to continue to buy energy in order for the system to be able to deliver RECs? The net, I think in practice, the answer is that you can just keep pumping energy out all you want, and that you just get a credit at the end of the year, and the credit goes to no one, and it's lost. or you get it comes, I'm sorry, it's not lost, it goes at the QF rate, not the QF rate. Each utility has a tariff for how net energy metering happens. Bottom line is, it's the tariff for net energy metering that determines that, it's not us. So as long as you produce that electricity, you produce the REC and we get the REC. So you would need to contact, you would need to look at the individual tariff, net energy metering tariff that you are on, which, as was pointed out earlier, can vary greatly between all the munis, the co-ops, and the investor-owned utilities. So I think that that's an answer that has a specificity that we can't address unless we know the details of that particular system.
I think it's also more complicated than that because, in fact, net metering is offered through alternative retail electric suppliers. So there's also a situation if someone switches suppliers, they have to re-enroll in net metering with their new supplier. And I think that's something that's going to be a fairly large administrative burden, but something that's really essential for making sure the benefits of solar flow through to the customer. But again, that's something that's outside of the scope of this program. We can't control anything. We look at the world through the lens of renewable energy credits and the program to purchase those. We'll do everything we can to facilitate that. There are aspects of this transaction that inherently can be between the customer and the utility.
And I just want to add one thing, just so you don't think that we're like, oh, it's the utilities, we don't have to worry about that. We don't care. We do talk to the utilities on a very regular basis. For example, the queue issue with lotteries, we've been extensively working with the utilities on that. So we do care. IPA does care. We do work very closely with the utilities. We do try to the extent that we can to harmonize the program. So if there's something that we're doing that just is stupid because it directly conflicts with the utilities, then please let us know about that. We do care about that. There are some things, though, that are part of an already approved tariff. We can certainly let the utilities know that it conflicts with our program, but we may not be able to do anything about it. So don't hesitate to let us know about something that we could do a better job of coordinating with utilities. Just be aware that we don't have a magic wand that we can wave and say utilities do this, but we can work within the processes that exist in the state to eventually work towards something that's better harmonized and maybe change our program as well. Go ahead.
Okay, you can identify yourself.
Oh, yeah, Andrew, on the clarification on the 10-day right, especially for customers, where the 3 days of federal law and state law that I like the 3-day right, will all those customers need extended contracts or just generally the better understanding of the needs of the
I believe that's drawn from the code. There may be some state law provisions related to 3 days, and I know that's common in a lot of places, and I know certainly other states with disclosure forms have 3-day right of decision. But I believe that is actually something that's not an open question.
Were you referring to systems that have already been developed or going forward?
Yeah, I'm just more curious if they right decision when that came from it. If that's part of the requirement or if that's
Section.
The question for those online is the 10-day right of rescission, which is in the disclosure agreement. What's the source, the legal source for that, and that it may conflict with a 3-day federal right?
Title 83 of the Administrative Code, Section 412.210, and I'm looking at provision D. I'm looking at provision D, excuse me. A residential customer wishing to rescind pending enrollment with a retail electric supplier will not incur any early termination fees if the customer contracts either the electric utility or the retail electric supply within 10 calendar days after the electric utility processes the enrollment request. So the code is explicitly noted in the plan, and so yeah.
Well, that's Aries code, which is different, but in the plan
Yes, so to be clear, in the approved long-term renewable plan, we stated that we intended to create marketing guidelines for ABC projects that were equivalent in scope and content to a listed set of Aries rules for the administrative code. We've now implemented many of those requirements proposal for the adjustable block program. We're not saying that, the Part 412 administrative rules apply as a matter of law to ABC solar projects. But we propose, and the commission approved, that we would create requirements that are roughly equivalent in content, and this is what.
And that's the question we're just kind of clarification for it, but just to confirm that we would not be, a lead would not be considered alternative electric suppliers.
Correct.
So for those online, the question was to clarify that you would not be considered an Aries if you were participating in this program, and the answer is correct. We will not. While the plan calls for us to adopt consistent guidelines, we are not considering you an Aries. Yep.
Regarding the need for disclosure of the manufacturing model, panels and, in the third party owned perspective, when it comes to those actually own those panels, they're going to be right. If often it's just a forecast for instance, or even in our warehouse or even in our PC, when those panels are actually installed. If we provided a list of, three different manufacturers, if one of these three, would that be sufficient supply, or do we need to actually provide the actual business model? Or is there any way to keep it amended?
The question for those online is, it's often hard to determine exactly what you're going to put on the roof several months later, and would it be okay to provide a menu of several potential panels that you're going to provide, or how would we amend it if we didn't? So that's another very common change that we see in every program, is the make of the panels. I can tell you what our concern is that you said you were going to put Canadian solar panels on, and then you put on some brand that nobody's heard of Chinese panels on, which would affect a lessee as well if they were under some kind of they were anticipating getting this power and they have a system that dies quickly. So that's our concern, is that there's not a bait and switch between radically different qualities of panels. I'm not sure that putting a list of 3 different panels doesn't meet that concern. I guess it's something we'd have to think about, or any other kind of options that you can provide to us.
Welcome to comment. I will just say that what we propose in the draft disclosures are the manufacturer of the PV panels and the make and model of the inverter. So that's what we're asking. That's what the draft disclosures request.
I'm not sure that way. I just want to make sure you understand what we're trying to avoid. So if you have some suggestions that would address that, maybe if you put 3 panels in and they're all 3 tier 1 panels, that would, we don't really care whether you give them. Yeah. Okay. The next question from online is, what's the timeline for the brochure and the disclosures? We obviously have to go through the stakeholder process in order to be able to produce those, and then as we understand, the faster we get these out, the better it is for both the program and you as approved vendors and potential approved vendors. So we will definitely attempt to get those out as soon as we can, while still honoring the stakeholder process. The next question is, or comment is, 5% time to zero holdback on SREC average system is approximately $538. Future value 8% APR of 15 years is $1,706. Does this seem fair to the customer? We can tell you're talking to the IOU on a regular basis from the wording and the burdens present. 11% IRR enjoyed by ComEd turns this future value of $538 into $2,573. So I believe that this comment is related to the collateral requirement and whether how that meshes with the investor-owned utilities legally provided rate of return versus whether the customer gets interest on it. I'm not sure if it's relevant actually to the disclosures here. If you have something specific to disclosures, we can certainly provide that. If it's whether or not we should have a 5% collateral holdback requirement, that's actually not at this point negotiable item. It's a fixed item in the plan. Certainly discuss that for future plan revisions.
One thing I want to note there also is, if you look at section 6.16.1 of the plan,
actually the option is a collateral requirement of 5% could either be done by posting a collateral or by the holdback. So you don't necessarily have 5% of the contract value held back for payment at the end. You could also get the full value of the contract payment and post, I suppose, a letter of credit as equivalent. That's really a choice that you would have. Asking us to do math on calculating IRRs in the middle of a meeting is probably beyond what we're capable of doing. So we certainly will look at those numbers, but again, the 5% number as a collateral requirement was something that was in the plan. It was in fact litigated. I believe there were parties that thought it should be higher and parties that thought it should be lower. This is where it ended up. So that's really a closed issue in terms of the amount based upon what the commission approved when they approved our plan.
I think the earlier comment that we account for that in the disclosure form is a good comment that we'll definitely take under advisement. Okay, trying to get back on schedule here. We will move, no more questions online or in the audience for this, and we'll move on to the next one since we're a little bit over schedule. So moving on to marketing material guidelines. The overall idea here, what we're trying to get at is we have to review your marketing material as the program administrator. We want you to know what standards we're using to review your marketing material, and we want to have standards to know what to review against. So that's what we're trying to get at here, is as concrete as we can, a set of standards for what your marketing material can and cannot be, so that it's pretty clear to you before you make up marketing material whether it's going to pass or not, and it's pretty clear to us when we review it whether it does pass or not, and there's as little ambiguity, knowing it's a very ambiguous subject, as little ambiguity as possible in that review process. Approved vendors will be able to upload their marketing material at any time in the portal. So once you become approved as an approved vendor, you will have another menu item that allows you to upload marketing materials. When you upload that, it will go to us for review. We'll let you know if there's any issues with it. If there isn't, then we will approve it. You will be able to go into that portal at any time and see the approved marketing material that you have there and re-download it if you want to. If there's approved marketing material or marketing material that you gave to us and we said you needed to change something, and then you provided a new version of it and we approved that final version, it's the final version that will be there, but we'll actually hold all of the data stays forever in the portal. And we intend to periodically check your marketing behavior. So a couple of different ways that we plan on doing that. One is that there is an inspection protocol, so systems will be inspected after they're installed, and we'll definitely be asking about this when we do those inspections. IPA reserves the right to do spot inspections on just marketing material of customers at any time. And if there's any complaints from customers, then one of the first things we'll ask for is any marketing material that they received, especially if it's a marketing material related complaint where someone is claiming that they were promised X and they got Y. Discussion items, the last thing I want to talk about is the program brand. So we're working on a brand for the program, which would be a program logo, a program tagline, potentially something that's less of a mouthful than AVP. So we're actively working on that now. When that brand is released, we will release it to you, and you will be allowed to use the brand when referring to this program. Discussion item here is around training. So kind of the one piece that is of concern to us is the amount of training that the sales force has who are selling these systems. And so on the one hand, we want to ensure a very rigorous high level of training to make sure that you don't have some random salesperson going out and making crazy promises that obviously can't be kept. On the other hand, that can be very onerous to do that, and so there's a balancing act there for the training requirements that run all the way from us having required training that we come up with that you have to give to your sales force and sign off that they've all had it, to you providing us a training plan, to some other option there. So we're looking for comments there, and then obviously any other comments you have on the marketing material guidelines, we welcome those.
Kevin, back to the concept of the brand. One reason we're developing a brand is because of federal law that restricts certain phrasing, such as clean energy or green energy in scenarios where the solar project has the intent to sell its rent somewhere else. situation where the recs are being sold or transferred elsewhere. We encourage everyone to read section 7.6.3 of the long-term renewables plan for some of the agency's thoughts about what would be permitted or not permitted under federal law. And when the brand is developed and released, we hope that vendors will refer to the brand in interacting with customers and seek to avoid the types of phrasings that the Federal Trade Commission has said are unlawful.
Hopefully everyone caught that online because this is something that Samir can say. So question online from this, the first question is a comment that most marketing material is on websites, and can a contractor provide a link to their website instead of having to upload every page of their website for us to review? I don't know why we couldn't do that. We'll certainly think of some, if there's any reasons that we couldn't. The only thing that jumps out to me right now is just the fact that websites change in many cases, you know, on a daily basis. The Illinois ABP.com website has changed 10 times in the last 10 days. So it would be incumbent on you, if you were making changes to your website, that you provide us an update every time you updated the website, and that we would review that. So something to keep in mind. On the flip side of that, we are only reviewing the marketing materials for this program. So if you're a nationwide solar leasing company and you have 3 pages that are devoted to Illinois solar, then those would be the pages that we'd be reviewing, not your entire site.
Seems like we're talking about two different things, you know, the two vendors and something that's on more like two different calls. But 90% of the market is something that comes from installers rather than the aggregate model. The aggregate might be providing different vendors. So are you envisioning gathering all the ongoing market material from the installer workers and that whole one, and making sure that, okay, here's market for installer 1, here's market for installer 2, drawing that different ways of companies. If one installer is really good, the entire vendor, the whole incentive down, or collectively saying, this installer is good, this market is good, it's good, not sure if they have to, seems like the installer might make a little more sense.
So it's a kind of intractable problem. I can answer the second part, which is that if you're an approved vendor that has multiple installers that are working for you, that you know, you definitely would differentiate between where the projects came from as to whether they met those requirements. I'll let Anthony speak to the broader question.
I think to me, actually, the first question is probably easier, and there's actually a paragraph on page 118 of the plan, which does specifically talk about the approved vendor is responsible for the entities downstream from them, you know, doing the collecting the right paperwork and such things. So the approved vendor, you're responsible for the entities you're working with. So yes, that is a burden of becoming an approved vendor. That is also one of the reasons why we provide, you know, we provided flexibility in the program of who, you know, it doesn't have to be an aggregator model. It doesn't have to be an individual installer model. We want something that would allow for aggregators. But ultimately, there's going to be an entity that has a contract with the utility that's going to be receiving the fund. That's, you know, contracts are really kind of where the buck stops. So that's why a lot of the stuff is focused on the approved vendor as the holder of the contract that receives the revenue. That being said, I think you do raise an interesting point. If you have an approved vendor working with many installers whose conduct varies, I would like to think that we would be able to distinguish between that sort of behavior. So, you know, hopefully as an approved vendor, you would take proper action to police the installers you work with. But I wouldn't see that inherently, unless we see patterns of things that are really disturbing, that we would inherently see a situation where the actions of one installer working with approved vendor would impact the other installers. That's obviously not fair to them, but we'll have to look a little bit at how to properly distinguish that.
Yeah, that's a good question that we hadn't thought about before, so we'll take that back. Please put that in your written comments as well. I mean, technically, there's no reason why we couldn't do that. Our actual architecture of what it would look like that would be most useful for those of you who are in that situation would be helpful for us to know. Otherwise, we'll just guess at what's the best thing for you. So let us know. I don't see a reason why we couldn't do something like that.
Along those lines, it seems like everyone's taking reasonable effort for all the subcontractors. Can you give more color on how we're envisioning for that? I'm assuming it's not looking through everyone who are installing websites every day, but
Why not?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's up to you to tell them if they make a substantial change to their website that, changes the marketing material that they provide that to you. Again, I think if there's an approved vendor that is more than once running afoul of the marketing material guidelines, it's incumbent on you as an approved vendor to either fire that installer and no longer work with them, or get them to provide you the information that you need to provide to us. So.
yeah, and again, I guess in all of this, the installers that need to be fired are going to have customers that have been misled and have already paid money. So the have the most at-risk customers that would then be ineligible for the program. Because there's kind of an interesting dynamic there where the people that would have the worst actions done on them are actually the farm.
Yeah, I don't think that, I completely agree with you, because like I said, we do exactly this, and I know exactly, I could name half a dozen installers that fall into exactly that category. So I don't think the intention would be, in other states, the intention would not be to bar, and I don't think any of them are present here, the intention would not be to bar the customers of that installer from, if marketing material review hadn't been done and they changed their website and were selling something that was completely untrue, obviously we wouldn't say that customers of that installer could no longer be there. But I mean, you are responsible as the approved vendor, and at some point, if that installer continues to if they can't find an approved vendor, then yeah, their customers are out of luck. But that's
One more question, much more specific. Approved vendors are not allowed to record the utility account number until we have signed contracts. But we also need a standard disclosure form, including the rate, which come off of a utility bill that a utility account number. I understand that that's in the area rulemaking where you can use some utility account numbers to set them up, and that was very problematic. I think this is very different, and utility account number will be gathered much earlier in the process in terms of developing the system, looking at bills, doing everything.
Yeah, that's a good point. We can internally talk about that. I get your point, and we actually use that account number to make sure that you don't submit, or other people don't submit duplicate accounts or applications. So we will collect that data in the Part 1 application. So to ban you from collecting that information early on in the process would be detrimental. So I understand where you're getting at with that. So for those online, the comment was banning approved vendors from collecting the account number. It makes it very difficult for them, because we are going to ask for that information later on. So and there's not a risk like there are with areas of someone slamming someone by switching their account without their permission. So.
On the other hand, if the intent is to use the utility default supply rate for purposes of calculating savings or payback estimates, then you just need the customer class and utility rate. You don't need their account numbers to produce that.
I mean, usually you'll get multiple bills, and you'll see how much power they're using. And that's a very early stage, definitely, in terms of developing the system. I just know that information is often available very, very early, and it's often necessary. Really barring collecting that anyway.
Yeah, the issue is if you said they couldn't collect it and they inadvertently, they got a bill and it has it. Plus, we'll actually be asking for it later on. So it might be in their best interest to collect it at some earlier stage in the process, just so they have it, because they'll need it later on. So.
We'll provide us comments on this, and
Yeah.
what the issues are, and then we can evaluate it properly. And I know very comments. It may be more relevant when we get to community utility, because it's more like an areas offer.
So for online questions, in a case where the approved vendor is managing only the administration of RECs, what marketing material requirements pass down to the installers and developers? Hopefully we just addressed that with the in-person question. It's a duplicate of that, but if you still have any questions on that, we can talk more about it. The identification of approved vendor agents. What's the agent ID number? See guidelines for marketing behavior, section 17A II on page 7. I believe, so from my memory of that section, it was that if you are just providing an ID for the agent with their agent ID number on it, that we didn't have to approve that, but I'll let you guys look that up.
I mean, most companies have some sort of unique identifier for each agent. I think the assumption is that if you have a unique identifier, it would be provided. Because if you have 2 John Smiths working for you and there's a problem, how do we know which John Smith it was?
Yeah, so the online participant Anthony's comment was that our goal was to be able to identify if there was an issue, who the actual agent was who was causing the issue, so that you would have an agent ID number there.
And also, again, that requirement was inspired, might say, by section 412.120 of Title 8.3 of the Illinois Administrative Code, which is areas of marketing rules. So in Part C of section 412.120, they have requirements for areas agents who do in-person solicitation, one of which was an agent ID number, and we thought that was an appropriate requirement for DG marketing. If anyone has written suggestions that doesn't make sense in this context, please feel free to provide that.
So to summarize Samir's comments, that comes from the ARIES requirement. It seemed like a reasonable requirement here. If you have any reasons why not, then let us know. But our idea was that we wanted to be able to identify who the customer had been talking to, and a unique ID number was a way to do that. The next question is, do we know of any training that ComEd, Ameren, and the utilities customer support teams will have, because customers may turn to their utility with questions and they'd like the utility customer service lines to know that these programs exist and be able to provide some assurance to the customer that this whole thing's not a scam, and maybe direct them to the program website. So a couple comments on that. One is that they can always call us as the program administrator. So you can always direct them to that website. The intent of the brand, and one of the goals of the brand, was to create legitimacy for the program for exactly this situation, so that customers, didn't think that you were trying to scam them when you sold this. So that's one of the things that we hope to accomplish with the brand, and we hope to be able to provide that assurance if you direct them to us and we talk to them. Talking to the utility customer service teams about that, that's not a bad idea that we
I know ComEd has started developing educational materials, for lack of a better word, around solar. I believe has references to the program. I'm not sure about Ameren or smaller utilities. So, I mean, they obviously are very knowledgeable about the program. How it diffuses through their companies is a little outside of our control.
Yeah, we talk regularly with them, and we can certainly bring it up and just as a point of comment. Might be harder for some of the munis and co-ops, but certainly for the investor-owned utilities. The next comment is, each approved vendor shall perform criminal background checks on all employees and agents engaged in in-person solicitation. The approved vendor shall maintain a record confirming that a criminal background check has been performed. This seems overreach and burdensome. Please provide those as written comments if you feel that. I think our intent was that came from the ARIES requirements. And
yes, sir. I believe Samir's checking that this comes from the requirements for ARIES for their personnel, and there have been at times issues where this has come to play. I remember at least a couple of years ago an incident involving a company doing door-to-door sales where one of their people got into a fight with an off-duty police officer. It turned out they had a flaw in their background check process. So this is where, in fact, the person should not have been employed in this realm. So we have empirical evidence that these sorts of things happen, which is why this is really important. We talked about people going into people's doors, to people's doors of their houses, talking to them in person. The idea that we don't have some sort of check there is really, really essential.
Yeah. Again, that comes from section 412.120 subsection K of the ICC area rules. And again, in the approved plan, we stated our intent to adapt the content from 412.120, several related areas for our own marketing message.
So to summarize for those on the phone, the requirement comes from the areas requirements. Adapting areas requirements was part of the plan, and Anthony just provided specific examples of door-to-door sales and their issues that have been experienced in the Aries marketplace with those who have a criminal background engaging in bad behavior while performing as an Aries salesperson. Next question is, are approved vendors required to also have a DG license to complete installations, or are only the installers required to have this license? If we're referring to the ICC requirement, that requirement is that the person doing the installation has that. The firm doing the installation has that, and that the approved qualified person who's doing the installation has that. So it's definitely possible that you would have approved vendors who are sent projects from installation companies, and the approved vendor themselves would not have to have that license. It's not a license; it's a certification.
Yeah, the qualified person status as defined in Part 468 of Title 83 of the Illinois Administrative Code is not a ICC certification. It's a status that an individual can attain by completing certain trainings or apprenticeships. Separately, any company doing DG installation, whether for the Decibel Block program or not, needs to be an ICC certified DG installer.
I'll just note that in the disclosure forms, that information is requested, so it differentiates between the approved vendor and the contact information there and the installer, which may be different. And as part of a subset of the installer contact information is a qualified person, under that provision.
And so just for those on the phone, we were just differentiating again that the firm level is a different requirement from the qualified person requirement. Both are required. And I will just add that there's a dual purpose of including that information here for us. One is to make sure that people meet the requirement, and two is that people may not be aware that that's a requirement if they're coming from out of state, and this makes that crystal clear right away. The next question is, an installer's representative will make in-person site visits to a potential customer and evaluate the site's azimuth orientation and shading before designing a system. The system will be designed before the customer signs a contract. Preliminary design versus final design needs to be distinguished. And I guess if you can, I'm not sure what that refers to in the marketing materials guidelines, but if you can maybe, it looks like Rex was the person who made that comment, if you can expand on that as to where we need to take that into account. The next question is number 9 on marketing materials states rules for in-person solicitation. Can this be changed to door-to-door solicitation? Because if a consumer wants us to come to their home before 9 or after 7, this section shouldn't prohibit that. So basically saying if a customer wants to schedule an appointment for someone to do the shading study at 7:30 in the morning, they should be allowed to do that. I think it's worded as a solicitation rather than a, maybe we can make sure it's clear in the wording that that there's a difference between a relationship, once a relationship's been established with the customer. I don't know how we
can certainly do that. I just, again, point out it is inspired by the Aries.
Yeah, it's a crucial difference here because doing a shading study is not something an Aries would do. So it's a different, it's a different thing to do. So I completely understand your question, and we will definitely address that.
I think it's important though to have it not just be door to door, because you could also have someone setting up a booth at an event or something like that. I believe some of this would cover that as well. But maybe some of it comes to making more clarity to the word solicitation, which to me means you're approaching the customer, not the customer.
Not the other way around, yeah. So for those online, we're talking about perhaps differentiating between whether the salesperson is approaching the customer or whether the customer is willingly approaching the salesperson or the company, and the differentiating between that may solve the potential problems there. All right, in-person question. Yeah. Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong, is
Yes, yeah, yeah.
And so my concern is, I get where you're going, because my concern is that as written, people would have to stop knocking doors at like 4:45 in December.
Yes.
Okay, so for those online, just pointing out that it's really early that we would be prohibiting people this. So Rex had, the previous question was about preliminary versus final design in section 6.7 design.
What document?
Maybe you can also tell us which document we're talking about. It might have been the disclosure.
Oh, that's 7. Okay.
Section 7, marketing.
Okay.
Section 7, marketing materials. Sorry. So we're looking that up now. Thanks.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the whole?
Yeah. There's the installer's representative will make an in-person site visit to a potential customer to evaluate the site's azimuth operation shading before designing a system. The system will be designed before the customer signs a contract. Preliminary design versus final design needs to be distinguished. So I think this actually goes to the subsequent question, which is that there may be a legitimate reason for the installer to be visiting the customer's house prior to the signing of a final contract, maybe perhaps multiple times that involve a final contract. So maybe we should think about talking about.
And there's also the issue you raised earlier that there are legitimate reasons why design may change during, even as late as the installation process.
Yeah. So, okay, I think we understand what the issue is there. So thanks for bringing that up. If you can put it in written comments as well. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
So oftentimes there's proposals, which is just a more general overload that's our new Google numbers or some other software. And then there's after that customer agrees before, then they do the actual inside, or like where they check all the structural stuff and make sure that they and all that. So there's two very different types of evaluations. And requiring that second one where you know, roll someone out and all that stuff is kind of really companies prefer to not do that. They have to actually experience on the board. So requiring essentially that they do that before the customer signs a contract.
So just to clarify, would it be common, to have the final installation contract signed before sending someone out to fill out the site, or would there be some kind of preliminary, letter of intent signed?
I think usually it's a contract, so they have to get a contract signed based on the initial design. Because the person who is out there initially will, look at the electrical and make sure it's feasible. And then when they do the actual site, complete site visit, if there's changes that need to be done, then they sign another contract, like they sign a different contract. But,
What would be the right of the consumer to get out of it if at that point they get cold feet?
after they sign,
After the preliminary contract, what is after the site visit? The changes of stuff that makes the customer uncomfortable with proceeding.
I mean, I don't know if I necessarily, I know our company, we allow it to cancel all the way up until it's installed, so it's kind of more than they are, or in practice. So you kind of don't hold it to it, and that cancel down the road. And then if we do the whole site, then it's fine. Significant structural positions,
I hear the point you're raising, but I think we need to think about this, obviously, from a consumer protection point of view, that if things change, customers are locked into something unreasonable, that's exactly what we don't want to have happen.
Okay, let's go back to next question online. Under Illinois Property Tax Code, if you purchase and install a rooftop PV system on your home or commercial building, your property tax assessment may increase. If you do not own the PV installation, it should not affect your tax assessment. You should talk to your local, county, or other tax authority for more information. Debunk this myth immediately.
Well, I know in the property tax code, there's a provision that says the incremental assessment from installing a PV system on your roof is limited to the evaluation that an alternative, hypothetical, traditional heating and cooling system would have. That's roughly what the property tax code says. I don't have a deep understanding of what that means in practice. That's why we didn't put a great deal of detail in our proposed language in the brochure there. Maybe the commenter on the webinar wants to add more color.
And I'll just say that I was.
Your assessment may request a complete state of Illinois P-tax-330 property tax.
I was just going to say that I know that it varies from state to state, obviously. So I know there's various states out there that have property tax exemptions from your valuation going up as a result of a PV system. But as far as I know, that's not the case.
Well,
yeah.
Thanks for those comments. If you can provide us your interpretation of what we're saying incorrectly, what we should say that would be correct, and then maybe someone we can talk to make sure we get that, and we'll independently try to also verify that.
Good to get that right.
I also added ISDA stands this way as well. All right. Any other questions on this topic? If not, we have a couple of extra minutes. Anyone in the room who has comments or questions on anything from the beginning, go ahead and come on down. And anyone online, I know I skipped some questions, but I have a list of 178 questions or whatever it is here in front of me, and I'm not going to be able to find the ones I skipped. So if you have any questions that are related to anything else that we've talked about today that we did not address when you asked them, please retype those for us, and we'll go ahead and answer them.
At this point, I think we could also open up questions maybe more generally about the program too.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and
maybe better or worse prepared to answer that depending on the question.
Yeah, happy to answer anything. We're basically in the closing comment section now. So recap of the key points are that we're looking for your comments on these specific areas. There's things that we can't do because the plan requires us to do them a certain way, but anything else that we've written or the law, but anything else that we've written is a proposal, so we welcome your comments. If you have any questions on what we were intending for the proposal, feel free to contact us separately. If you contact us with a question just to clarify what we were trying to get at with the proposal, that won't be published. You don't have to have a redacted version of that or anything. We'll just do our best to answer that. But then your actual comments on what we should do, please provide those to us so that we can publish them so that everyone can see them. And so that's kind of what we're looking for here. The next steps, we've got the dates for the, and unfortunately our second screen died here, so I apologize to both those online and those here that I can't put the final screen, which says that comments are due by 5 p.m. Central Time on the 19th for approved vendor registration requirements, and by 5 p.m. on the 26th. So just reiterating what was already in the slides for the rest of the documents that we provided here today. And the appropriate email address for comments is comments@illinoisabp.com. So any other questions on any other aspects of this that we haven't covered today, or any other aspects of the program, we have a few more minutes to address those.
One comment I did earlier on the slide, for feedback, whether what's presented was a form of brochure is enough, or if we want specific contract guidelines, very helpful.
Okay, if you can provide details, if you agree with that, anyone online or here, what areas would need to be addressed on that would be helpful for us. There's another question, and maybe this actually may shed light on the previous issue we're talking about, property tax. is whether residential incentives, rebates, and grants are taxable or not. So that's a different question than whether your property tax assessment goes up. So I just want to differentiate between those two things. And we're not in a position at this point to make a determination on whether the incentive itself is taxable to the person who receives the incentive, simply because every recipient is different, and whether it's taxable or not is in large part dependent on the recipient as well as the nature of the incentive. And so if there's a way that you can tell us that we can very clearly and concisely state something that the tax consequences that applies to every possible recipient, then we welcome having that. Absent that, we would tend to want to remain silent on that.
We're not tax lawyers, and more importantly, even if we were, which we're not your tax attorneys. So I think, as Kevin said, this is ultimately something people need to seek their own counsel on.
So a question from back earlier on that we weren't able to get to is, can you describe how the approved vendor status works in the context of one entity that is developing a portfolio of 3 to 4 community solar projects, each of which will sign its own REC contract? So kind of inherent in the last sentence, each of which will sign its own REC contract, would be that each solar project would be owned by a separate entity, and each entity would then need to be a single project approved vendor. So if you had one entity that was developing these projects, each of your special purpose entities would register as an approved vendor, and then each one of those would register their project that they owned, and they would be responsible for it as an approved vendor. Alternately, though, you could have the parent organization act as the approved vendor for all of those projects as well. It's entirely up to you to do it either way. Right, no more questions online. Anyone else here that has any questions or comments? The comments line is available for comments, but you can always contact us at the Adjustable Block Program at admin@illinoisavp.com, and the phone number is provided as well. So feel free to use that line for any questions you have outside of the actual comments period. Same people are checking the comments as well. So any way you get it to us, we'll get it and we'll get back to you. Yep, we have one more question, comment here.
Sorry, just a question for clarification. So, if you sign up to be an approved vendor for one single project, some of the testing the program does say you may not have to comply with all the testing.
Correct.
Does that
Yep.
include the whole thing? You don't have to comply with training, you don't have to comply with before you go to you, you comply with
if you're, yeah, I would say not comply might not be the term I would use, but if you are a single project approved vendor, then it's not required that your marketing materials be reviewed. So all of those marketing material review guidelines would not apply to you because it's not required that your marketing materials be reviewed. I would say, you know the intent of the approved vendor, or I'll share the intent of that single project approved vendor would be that, for example, you're a company that's developing your own project, you're a project developer and you're developing this project and you own the project. Obviously there isn't any marketing going on and we're trying to avoid that. To the extent that it appears that an entity is using the single project approved vendor model in order to avoid providing marketing materials, that we would obviously constructively construe that you were trying to do that, but I'll let Anthony.
Yeah, I think there's a provision in the plan that actually gets that point, that we see people using this to try to get around something, we obviously would not look on that kindly. Also, there's a minimum size for single project, approved vendors. The place that maybe is a little unclear is if this is really a relationship between the approved vendor and the project. If this project is a community solar project, this does not speak at all to the requirements around consumer protections and disclosures and marketing requirements to sell subscriptions to that community solar project. So I want to be very clear that this is only about the relationship between the entity that owns or hosts the project and the approved vendor, not downstream people when we get to community solar. Okay.
Right.
So it's not a batch, that's
A project, right. So just for those online, the question was whether a single project approved vendor was exempt from the marketing material review requirements. That was what we were answering. Sorry, I didn't clarify that. Next question from online: if we are approved vendor for DG systems, can we apply separately as a single project approved vendor for either 1 2 megawatt project or 1 community solar project? There's really not a concept of why you would be 2 approved vendors if you're the same entity. So 1 entity can only be 1 approved vendor. And
You could set up an LLC.
you could, yeah. I guess if you wanted to, you could set up a special purpose entity and that could become an approved vendor. But if you are an approved vendor, you would simply add on that you are also a community solar approved vendor, or that you were a DG approved vendor, or both. You know, whatever it is that approved vendor is doing. We don't have it set up, and we don't intend to have it set up that you would set up multiple approved vendor accounts for 1 single entity, and we would like to avoid that. And when we're aware of other places where that's happened, and there's really no benefits to it, and there are detriments to it. So if you have a good reason for why we should do that, then please let us know, knowing that there's it doesn't immediately jump to mind that there are benefits, so we would need you to share those with us. The last question is, you're not accepting any approved vendor applications after the January 15th date for the REC program. That's not correct. So that was a question, and the answer is no. We'll be accepting approved vendor applications until the program is no longer running. The caution I would have is that if you would like to make sure that you can submit an application on January 15th, as soon as the program opens, that you submit your approved vendor application to us sooner so that we have a chance to review it. We review those pretty quickly, but if there's an issue with it, then we want to be able to have time to ask you to correct that issue and give you time to correct the issue and us time to check and make sure that you have. And so if you submit it to us at the last minute, then you will not afford yourself that opportunity. So it's entirely up to you, but you could certainly apply to be an approved vendor in July of next year if you'd like.
Relatedly, if you have written comments, we certainly welcome them earlier than the...
Yeah, I'll emphasize that in case you didn't hear it on the phone. So our experience so far, all the written comments have come in the last 3.5 minutes of the comment period, which was 2 weeks long, and in this case is 2 weeks or 10 days. So if you can provide those earlier to us, it doesn't give you a huge advantage, but it will allow us to more carefully review those. It's better for the program because we're trying to get this launched on November 1st, and to the extent that we can get the extras on, like the API and the e-signature for the disclosure forms and the the other extra things that people have asked for, like the having disclosure forms available to everyone. The sooner you let us know about that, the sooner our developers can start working on that, and the sooner we'll be able to roll that out, concurrent with November 1st or immediately after. So it benefits the program and you if you have comments like that to get them to us now, because we can start, if we all agree internally, we're talking about these comments. We don't wait to open them until the last day. We start talking about them and looking at them as soon as they come in. If we can look at it.
One caveat on that.
Okay. If we can see those earlier, that's better for us because it gives us more time to review those.
So as we've mentioned several times, we post comments on our website so people can see what other comments are. That would not happen until after the comment period is closed, because we don't want people commenting on commenting,
right.
comments, then on commenting on comments and comments. That is really to aid us in our internal review, rather than, so don't worry about submitting comments early and that may influence other people's comments. It's really to help give us the time to give your comments the due consideration they deserve.
To summarize for those online, Anthony was stating that we will not publish your comments until after the comment period is closed. So while we'll be internally looking at them, we won't be sharing them with anyone else. So don't worry about that. So again, there's no reason not to get your comments in earlier, except
human nature.
Just general procrastination, which none of us here ever do. So we don't really understand it. But one more question from online. Can you give us a rough estimate as when these disclosure forms will be available? There will be customers who have already had systems installed, and installers will need time to address this prior to January 15th. So well aware of that. I can tell you on the software side, we're already coding this version of a disclosure form.
into the site, so it'll be ready to go. But to the extent that there's changes and comments, and it may not be ready on November 1st to go. But we fully understand that the sooner that we have this, the better. And we're trying to get as much work as we can do in advance, while respecting the stakeholder process, to make sure we can, that we don't say, well, no, that's a good idea, but that would require us to redo this whole section of code, so we're not going to do it. We don't want to fall into that trap either. So, all right, we'll be available for a few minutes afterwards if anybody has questions. If there's nothing else here or online, we will call it an evening, and we'll be posting this shortly to the Illinois ABP website, both the recording and the set of slides.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.